Good afternoon and bienvenue, everybody. Welcome to the workshop, Climate Disinformation, Turning Insights into Action. My name is Jennifer Irish. I'm the director of the Information Integrity Lab at the University of Ottawa. From this place at the University of Ottawa, we pay respect to the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people who are traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. Whether you're joining us, wherever you are joining us, we encourage you to pay respect to all Indigenous peoples across Canada. Before we launch into the workshop, I'd just like to say a couple of words about the Information Integrity Lab. We were established just under 3 years ago in response to the digital revolution that has led to a surge in the prevalence of mis and disinformation. Whether disseminated accidentally as misinformation or purposefully as disinformation, distorted information confuses public discourse and impedes action. Taking a multidisciplinary approach, the lab serves as a hub for innovation, knowledge, and ideas exchange. Our overall mission is to advance a deeper understanding of the drivers, dynamics, and impacts of mis and disinformation within a changing information environment and promote information integrity. This workshop is part of the InfoLab's Path to the Summit. That means Path to the Global Summit on Climate, Mis and Disinformation. This is a series of initiatives supported by the Trottier Family Foundation and completed in collaboration with a wide range of partners, including CRIM of Montreal. We had our launch in October 1st with an event called Climate Change and Misinformation Clearing the Air, where we were honored with a keynote address by Catherine Hayhoe. She spoke in particular about the challenge of science communication in the era of mis and disinformation. And that is a theme that we are going to draw through all of our events, including in today's workshop. Today, this workshop, Turning Insights into Action, will focus on sharing information about current research and policies being pursued to respond to climate misinformation. But we hope in particular to be able to identify multidisciplinary strategies, tools, and policies to counter climate disinformation, including through public awareness, resiliency, and practical solutions. Just a pitch in terms of what our upcoming events. On March 27th, we will be in collaboration with CRIM of Montreal, have a conference on images and influence countering visual and multimodal disinformation. And we do have a publication that will be available within the next week or two that covers our latest research done in collaboration with the Computer Research Institute of Montreal on visual and multimodal disinformation. So we urge you to come to this event as well, which will take a more technology approach to the questions that we're going to be covering today. We are also doing a specialty conference on Arctic and climate change, the intersection of geopolitics and disinformation. So we are doing that also in Montreal, in collaboration or adjacent to the NATO Center of Excellence, which is doing a summit at the same time on climate change and security. All of these events will feed into the summit on the 17th and 18th, which we will be hosting here at the University of Ottawa in a very innovative center. So I do wish to now put it over to our moderator, Andrew Heffernan. So Andrew is an adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa in international relations. He's also a professor in climate change, and he has different roles, including with SIGI and their digital hub, but he's here in his capacity as our climate associate. So he's going to lead you through discussions today, and very much look forward to hearing the different perspectives that you have to bring, hoping that we can move past analysis and focus on what works, tools, strategies, and interventions that can strengthen public resilience to mis and disinformation and inform more informed policy responses. So without further ado, Andrew, we're in your good hands, and I look forward to what this workshop accomplishes and coming back at the end with some concluding remarks. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and welcome to everyone here. Thank you so much for giving us your extremely valuable time. We know it is very limited, and especially on a Friday afternoon, so it is very much appreciated, both for the panelists as well as the broader participants that are out there in the audience. We will make sure that we do our best with the time. We've framed this event today really as a workshop, and the idea is hopefully everybody is going to take something away from it. I think so often these events are individuals or organizations that are really sharing their expertise with an interested room full of people. But we really hope that this is going to serve as a two-way exchange, and we hope to learn as much as you do today. And we really do hope that it is really constructive and that everybody can take a fair bit away from it and really be directed, as Jennifer already mentioned, towards solutions very specifically, rather than just having conversations about this pressing issue, which we will discuss a little bit more here today. So with that, I'll say a bit more on what we aim to get out of today, and speak a bit more to what Jennifer had mentioned with our pathway to the summit. And we're kind of sharing our goals, showing you a bit of behind the curtains, behind the scenes, because again, we want you to be part of this. We want you to be part of today. This is not us simply coming at you, sharing our expertise with you, but we're really hoping that you can help shape our lab's pathway to the summit and beyond. So we want to share our goals because we don't want these to be just discussions about the problems that exist, which I think we are all increasingly aware of. But we do want it to be very much a working event that can be productive discussions on helping us chart our paths and having everyone on the panels as well as the audience to all work towards the same kinds of goals and ensure that as fairly like-minded organizations and researchers, we are not overlapping or working in different directions, but ensure that we can really have harmony to, again, actually start moving the needle on the problems of climate change very broadly, and then more specifically for today, the bigger problem of disinformation that is really impeding our ability to deal with the climate crisis, but impeding our ability to deal with many other issues as well. So with that, really our goals are to develop a multi-year action plan based on the deliberations from the pathway to the summit and beyond that Jennifer spoke about. So we are convening these events, again, not necessarily just to share information, but to really think about these deliberations in an important way, to think about what kind of place organizations like our own and those you might be affiliated, what kind of place and role we can and should be filling in these very complex ecosystems of information. We really want to develop tools, toolkits, ideas, policies, things that are practical, implementable, and can really make a difference, right? These can look like any number of things, and we are coming at this from a place of humility, not thinking that there is any one way to approach this kind of thing, and that is really why we've reached out to this room full of experts to help us lay the groundwork for our path to the summit and beyond, and thinking about what kind of role we might be able to play at the COP30 summit, which is coming up in Brazil as well. So largely, we are hoping that you can help us set our agenda and that we can all set agendas together moving forward on the years ahead, again, so that we can make sure we are all working collaboratively, building on what works, learning from what doesn't, and trying to move forward with, as the framing document for today suggested, a whole of society approach for dealing with climate disinformation. So where do you all fit in? As mentioned, we really come at this with a place of humility in thinking about whole of society approaches, as we will continue talking about today. there's no one way to govern information. There is no one organization or think tank or lab or university or researcher, politician, you name it, that is going to be able to deal with disinformation, that is going to be able to deal with climate disinformation or the climate crisis. This is one of those things that we are really going to have to put meat on the bones of what it means to have a whole of society approach, which builds from the term that we hear so often, whole of government approaches, but government itself won't be nearly enough to deal with these issues, especially as there is increasing concern about, and often I think disdain for, government in general, and maybe expertise beyond that, which is a little bit scary, I think, for people in this room. Many of us who have spent most of our lives dedicated to developing expertise on this topic. And if expertise and legitimacy are no longer seen as effective methods of conveying information, I think that raises a whole number of questions. And that's why we have to make sure that we are having broad enough buy-in from a large number of segments of society, all industries, people from all walks of life. Everybody is plugged in to social media and these increasingly complex networks of information that have also, I think, increasingly become unhealthy. And as a result, we need to speak to all of those people, meet them where they are at, meet people from every industry and walk of life, as I've mentioned, to speak their language in order to start contributing to somewhat of a healthy information ecosystem once again. And part of that humility suggests that it's not going to be easy. We are here today to talk about solutions, and the climate summit that we are working towards is really going to be solution driven. That being said, we realize that there are no simple solutions, and we are not here looking for individual panaceas, but to really begin pushing these conversations to the next step beyond, as Jennifer mentioned, analysis. I think that all of us here are aware that the climate crisis is bad, disinformation is a problem, and now we're going to hopefully put our heads together and think about what to do with it. So for today's workshop, it is structured as a two-part interactive discussion, each focusing on various dimensions of climate myths and disinformation and the many challenges involved with that. So the first session, which will run from, I was going to say roughly, but we're going to try really hard to stay on time, from 1:15 to 2:45 is on building public awareness and resilience to climate myths and disinformation. We will have a short 15-minute break, and then for the next session, which will run from 3 to 4:30 p.m., that session will be on practical solutions and policy responses for informed climate action. This is a bit of a long event, and it can be tough to keep our synapses firing and to keep thinking deeply during this long of a time, especially online. And we are very cognizant of this, but we thought we would have it online to maximize participation and minimize disruption to people's schedule. So while much of our other programming will be in person, we do hope you can join us for those future events. We do realize that 4 hours online can be tough. If you do need to step out at some point, we totally understand, but we do hope that you can stay with us, and we do hope we can all stay fairly focused for this really productive workshop as discussed. For the format and for participation, I will begin each session by offering just a few brief framing and context building remarks. After this, I will invite our panelists to share their thoughts on the panel themes based on their specific expertise, coming at these issues from the various facets of society, as they each have their own diverse backgrounds and perspectives, and that's why we have invited these specific folks here. I have asked panelists to keep their remarks brief. We're going to try to avoid the usual 12 to 15-minute presentations that leave less time for conversation. So the panelists will hopefully be maintaining their remarks to 5-7 minutes maximum. And then we will have more time for free-flowing conversation after that and to tease out more of their expertise and dynamic backgrounds. A quick note on the panelists themselves. All of them have extremely impressive backgrounds. And to be honest, I think I could fill the afternoon just rhyming off their impressive accolades and accomplishments. But again, being cognizant of the fact that it is Friday afternoon and the very specific focus of this workshop is really building towards real-world solutions, I'm going to forego really reading their bios at the start of each panel and instead just introduce the panelists with their current primary positions. But their bios do appear on the webpage for this event where you would have registered, and I definitely invite everyone in the audience to take a read through their bios to get a bit more of the background on these really amazing panelists. For the panels, I will go in order as the panelists appear on the program. And following the brief remarks from the panelists, I will provide kind of a few thoughts, bringing together common themes and approaches that emerge from the panelists. And then moderate what we really hope is going to be more of a, instead of just a Q&A, more of an interactive discussion where I will invite the rest of the participants to react to the interventions of the panelists by building on what was discussed, maybe expanding on some of the solutions suggested. Certainly, you can pose questions and maybe even challenge some of what was said throughout the presentation, though of course doing so respectively and constructively. There will be 3 primary ways to participate in today's workshop. First, I would invite people to, once you're invited following the panelist interventions, to raise your Zoom hand electronically. This should be through the raise hand function in Zoom. At this point, you will actually be invited into the Zoom room, so you will have access to your video and microphone, and we are hoping that you can pose your question, again, to facilitate dialogue and a bit of a back and forth. And I will really ask that everybody keep these short. Be sure to introduce yourselves very briefly at the start. But we do have a very large audience of really impressive experts and a great deal of material to cover in a fairly finite time. So I really will ask that everyone keep their questions quite succinct and pose them either to the panel sort of generally or directly pose your questions to specific panelists. There will also be a chat box function. If you would prefer to submit a text version of your question, you could do so through that chat box rather than coming into the Zoom room and posing your question. We would love to see you. We would love to hear from you, but we are happy to collect questions and read those out for you and on your behalf as well. And then the third ability or option for participation, which we will discuss a little bit more later and give you a bit more details on how to do so, is through an interactive virtual MIRO board. And this is going to serve as sort of a digital brainstorm that's going to collect ideas and build on the solutions discussed today. And we're going to be able to see these. And the plan is that we're going to work with these today, certainly, but then be able to share them afterwards. So that, again, everybody who is here today can take something with them and consider this as you are at future events, as you are having future conversations, as you are working on your own research and trying to implement solutions in whatever walk of life and contributions towards fighting climate change and disinformation that you are doing. With all of that being said, I see we're already a couple minutes behind, so we are going to really move along here. We do have a jam-packed schedule. So with that, I'm going to thank everybody once again, and we will very quickly jump into the first panel, which again comes to me and setting the stage a bit for this first panel. So as mentioned, we are looking at whole of society approaches to trying to tackle climate disinformation. And today, as one of the key parts of the pathway to our summit in June, we are building on this report, which you can see on the deck. This is a report that was prepared by me and the lab. Hopefully everybody received it. I'm sure everybody took the time to thoroughly read it in preparation for today's event. But it is available on our website if you have not had the chance yet. We definitely welcome everybody to take a look. This first panel is really going to be based on the first substantive section of this paper and is really building on public awareness and resilience to climate disinformation, which we really see as the first step in developing these kinds of whole of society approaches. I think for the most part here, we are all aware of the issues that disinformation is creating in our society, as well as the increasingly existential threat that the climate crisis is really posing to our world. I think it's undeniable. We are seeing it all around us. We are seeing it with increased frequency, and we are seeing it really significantly with increased severity at the same time. And as someone personally who has been researching climate change for well over a decade, of all the reasons for pessimism that do exist, one of the key takeaways I have personally found over the years, and I'm thinking about more and more, is actually a reason for optimism. And I would argue that we really have the tools at our disposal to effectively tackle climate change, which might be counterintuitive because we're also not really doing a great job of it at this point. But whether thinking about the fact that renewable energy sources are now more cost effective than burning fossil fuels for the most part, there is, I think, a growing pushback on kind of the unfettered capitalism and corporate interests that have wrought so much of the environmental devastation on the planet. or even the fact that I'm often reminding my students that we were at one point we were on target for well over 4 degrees Celsius in warming. And now we've already brought that down to, slightly over 3 degrees, depending on how you measure it. And while 3 degrees is problematic and there's a lot more work to do, the fact that we've already brought warming down by at least 1 degree, I think does pose reason for optimism. There's a lot more work to do, but all of which to say, I do think increasingly we do have those resources at our disposal to tackle the monumental challenge that is the climate crisis. That being said, now what I see the real issue as is getting broad enough buy-in from the public around the world to continue to effectively enact these policies and effectively invest in the types of tools and resources that we need to keep getting that warming trajectory, to keep coming below 3 degrees, eventually, hopefully, to the Paris Agreement of 2 degrees, and maybe just possibly limiting climate change to only 1.5 degrees of warming, which is the real target in the Paris Agreement. So with that, we've framed the report around a number of guiding questions, which we have laid out for this first panel as well. And as most of you here today are undoubtedly aware, really the scourge of disinformation in recent years has, I think, become one of the major limiting factor to effective climate action, certainly here in Canada, but globally as well. And as such, building public awareness and resilience to climate disinformation has become truly integral and what I believe to be one of the most important challenges of our time. It is really particularly a wicked problem, particularly because any attempt at governing information has really been historically fraught, and any attempt to do so by governments, as I've kind of already alluded to, is problematic and likely not even desirable by any means. And as a result, trying to deal with this problem of disinformation, I think, requires a whole of society approach to address these challenges, because we were really only going to be able to achieve healthy information ecosystems if we do have effective buy-in from a critical mass of every sector and facet of our societies. And in order to address these issues, in this paper, we have included a number of guiding questions, and we really hope that you will consider the questions. There's a few of them listed here in the PowerPoint, but there's many more throughout the sections of the report that, again, is available online on our website. And we hope that you will work with us. We hope to work through some of these questions today, in this panel, in the next panel, but you can contact us at any point. We welcome suggestions for our future events leading up to and including the summit and beyond. These are the kinds of questions that we think can help us guide our research, guide our next steps. But there are only some questions. And again, coming at this from a place of humility, we realize that there are known unknowns, but also unknown unknowns, and we might not even be asking all the right questions yet. So again, we have brought all of you here today to help start answering the questions that we have outlined, both in this PowerPoint and in the report. But beyond that, we really hope that you will help us continue to build on these questions as well, to make sure that organizations like ours can work with you and your organizations and make sure that we are all answering the questions effectively and making sure that we're all asking the right ones as well. So with that, by way of brief introductory remarks, I am extremely happy to introduce our panelists who will kick off today's workshop discussion. To start off, we are going to have Carignan, who is with l'Université de Sherbrooke, a co-holder of the UNESCO Prev Chair. Following that, we will have Gareth Gransaull, who is co-executive director of Regeneration. After that, we will have Sherilee Harper, who is a Canada Research Chair in Climate Change and Health at the University of Alberta. And finally, we will have Chris Russell, as academic director at ReClimate, and he's a professor at Carleton University. So thank you so much all again for being here. And with that, Marie-Ève, would you like to kick us off for our first panelist discussion today?
Yes, thank you. I will share my screen in one moment. You see the presentation? Good. So I will be brief. Like Andrew just said, we want to keep time for the discussion, which will be more important today. But just a few remarks. I want to present what the UNESCO Pref Chair is doing about climate disinformation, and also I will share some little findings about the first step of one of our research. So why the UNESCO Chair in Prevention of Radicalization and Violent Extremism is working on climate disinformation. It's because we see in the ecosystem that it could have a link with other kind of polarization and also sometimes violent polarization. So it's really a concern for us. And now we have maybe 3 main projects about climate misinformation. The first one is about misinformation and climate change in Quebec and Canada, but we focus mainly on Quebec, especially for the first part of the research. So we're working on actor discourse and adherence and solution. And it was found by Fonds de Recherche du Québec, Société Culture, and also by the Sherbrooke University. So it's a 3-step project. The first one is looking on social media, what we could see about climate disinformation, especially in the Quebec province, because there was really not that much of information about how climate disinformation is shared and spread in the Quebec province and mainly in the French ecosystem in Canada. We will also conduct a pan-Canadian survey about populational survey to understand how people believe in some kind of climate disinformation, and we can make some cross with that survey. And the third part of that research, which will focus on some solution to conduct dialogue with the population. So we will try different kind of solution like a motivational interview, but focus on climate disinformation. We know that motivational interview work well about the vaccination hesitancy. So we will observe how it could work with climate disinformation and how we could establish some kind of dialogue between people who are concerned and unconcerned about climate change. And our second big research is about the communication about the climate change. So it's a research that is named Informing and Campaigning Without Polarizing. How can public communications by environmental group help reduce misinformation and political radicalization? It's a research that we conduct with Équiterre in Quebec. So the report will be released really shortly, maybe in 1 month or 2. And we look about how different NGOs can communicate, but not polarize people that don't believe in climate change or that not always agree with some of the solutions that are proposed with this by these NGOs. So we are working on that. And last but not least, we have a monitoring team who's working every week for the UNESCO Pref Chair, and the team is working about different topics that are related to polarization and disinformation. And one of the topics are climate change. So they check who share climate change information, what are the topics, what are the main concerns that we should have about that monitoring. So it's really interesting because it keeps us on page every week about what is happening on our ecosystem about disinformation. And very quickly, I want to just share some of the first results that came from our analysis of online information in Quebec about the climate disinformation. So we observed different influencers that have more than 1,000 followers that was located in Quebec and share some different disinformation and different discourse about climate change. So we analyzed until now more than 170 publications according to a typology that we choose that was created by Cohen and al. In 2021, and that allow us to categorize the different kind of climate misinformation that we observe online in the Quebec online environment. Some of our general finding is that the production of climate disinformation increased during specific events. For example, when there forest fire, when there's floods, when there's storms, we saw really an increasing number of different discourse saying that there is no climate change or that it's a conspiracy from different authority and government or NGOs, for example. We also saw that increase when there's different environmental meetings, for example, the COPs or the GIEC. And we also observed that in Quebec, a lot of the accounts sharing misinformation about climate change are the same account that were sharing different kind of misinformation about the COVID-19 pandemics. So the same people that we were looking at five years ago are the same that are still active and now searching different crises and different topics to share their political views, different beliefs, and they are really active about climate. For example, they use a terminological hybridation, sorry for a term using on the COVID-19 pandemic. So for example, in the COVID-19 pandemic, they use a lot in their publication, vaccinal passport, saying that we will be confined and that we will be checked by the government. And now we saw the same terminology about carbon passport or health confinement, climate confinement. So when we talk about different solution to have less transportation and be more local, they saw that as a confinement, for example. So that is a link that is really interesting, because these are the same individuals that try to convince people that there is some kind of manipulation about climate disinformation, and they were talking about the same manipulation about the COVID pandemic. And the last result that I want to share with you is what kind of discourse that we observed the most in our analysis of this first publication. Mainly the principal kind of discourse that was sharing online is the fact that public authority and scientific are not reliable, and so that you cannot believe what they are saying. Second one is the fact that just climate change are not happening. It's fake news. It's a way to manipulate people. So there's no climate change. Or if there is climate change, they are not bad. Sometimes some influencers say climate change is good for us, it's good for the environment, and they are not that bad. So we saw also a lot of publication about the fact that climate change won't work, different solution won't work, so we don't have the good solution to fight climate change. And sometimes the solution that seems more accepted are the technological one. And finally, some of the publication was about the fact that climate change is not linked with human activity, so there's no link between climate change and human activity. So that's it for now. I just want to introduce what was our first finding and what are the subjects that we are working on right now, but I will be happy to discuss more about that later.
Thank you so much, Marie-Ève. Very interesting presentation, and you were right on time, so we really appreciate that. And we will jump right into the next panelist. Gareth, if you want to share your screen, you can start us off.
Yes, thank you, Andrew, so much. It's wonderful to be here with everybody. My name is Gareth Gransaull. I'm the Executive Director of Regeneration, which is a climate advocacy organization that I founded, as well as a researcher at the Institute for Integrated Energy Systems at the University of Victoria. This conversation, I think, is very timely given the sort of fever dream of politics over the last couple of weeks and the inauguration of a president who believes that windmills cause cancer. And I would say apologies to the host, because my presentation is a bit more focused on analysis than solutions at this current point. And that's because I truly believe that as a movement, the climate movement hasn't correctly diagnosed the issues of where we are. And if we want a whole of society approach to the problem of both climate and misinformation, we have to analyze systems in holistic ways. And that involves looking at disciplines like sociology and political economy and social psychology. In my opinion, we are living in the age of climate barbarism. And it's no coincidence that democratic institutions and the global climate are collapsing simultaneously. And to me, this is because the history of fossil fuel politics and the history of the corporate influence on democracy are in fact two sides of the same process. And to understand why, we must then also understand that the concept of misinformation is not actually new or even unique to the digital age. This man on the screen is Edward Bernays, who is probably the most important man that you've never heard of and the architect of consumerism in the 20th century. He was actually the nephew of Sigmund Freud, who invented the term propaganda, which was later rebranded to Public Relations, and helped found the field of corporate PR, which was when companies realized that they could do mass marketing and government lobbying all under the same roof. And the importance of knowing this is that science disinformation has been part of the corporate playbook on public communications for the last 100 years. And you have firms like Hill and Knowlton that invented this for the tobacco industry, and those techniques were imported into the fossil fuel conversation. And there's fantastic work on this done by Amy Westervelt, who's a journalist with Drilled Media. But I wanted to particularly talk about the way that these kinds of propaganda systems work. They have a very clear logic. One is that it can be split into two audiences. The first is treetops propaganda that's really aimed at elites through think tanks and foundations and that are aimed at convincing the spectrum of opinion among elite decision makers. And then there's grassroots disinformation, which is aimed at the masses, which is through public astroturfing campaigns, digital media, mainstream media, etc. The fossil fuel industry in particular uses a diagram that I would like to, a network structure that can be seen in this diagram, which is sort of like a megaphone through which layers of disinformation are disseminated out to broader categories of the public through various layers of support and organizational assistance. And this is a structure that has been very, very successful in the global profusion of climate denial in a way that far predates the invention of the internet. And I also wanted to point out the deep interweaving between the fossil fuel industry and also right-wing climate denying movements around the world. And in particular, what you're looking at here, and I apologize if this is a bit hard to see, I'll send the link in the chat later, is a network of the constellation of actors that are involved with essentially a lot of right-wing groups in Canada that have major ties to the fossil fuel industry, including here Gwyn Morgan, who is the former CEO of Encana, a pipeline company, and money that is provided to a lot of other climate denying groups. The Canada Strong and Free Network, which is at the center of the right-wing network that is about to ascend to power with the likely future Conservative government. And then you can see up here the Atlas Network, which is a network of global think tanks around the world founded by a man named Anthony Fisher. And I would say that Anthony Fisher is possibly the second most important man that you've never heard of, because he is really the architect of the global trend towards free market fundamentalism that benefits corporations over people, and largely funded by fossil fuel interests. He went around the world setting up conservative think tanks in country after country with the explicit goal of pulling countries away from social democracy and towards market fundamentalism. And if you want to see more data about this these days, you can see the international research consortium called Reactionary.International, which is exploring a lot of these groups and how they're linked to contemporary authoritarian governments. This played out in Canada in a very particular way, and I want to highlight the role of one man in particular. In his recent memoir, Thomas D'Aquino wrote this book called Private Power, Public Purpose, which explores his history as the founder of the Business Council of Canada, and he has arguably played a much more influential role in public policy in this country than any other person, calling himself the CEO of CEOs. And in particular, he played a major role in convincing both decision makers and the public to agree to the NAFTA, a free trade agreement, which had an energy sharing agreement that greatly benefited the fossil fuel industry and played a major role in the massive expansion of the oil sands. But he also played a role, very importantly, during the Harper government as the vice chair of this group called the Energy Policy Institute of Canada, which was an effort by the fossil fuel industry and aligned groups to influence Canadian energy policy during the Harper government and turn Canada into an energy superpower. And so the reason why I'm saying all of this, if it sounds a bit off topic, is that we have to understand what French philosopher Bruno Latour calls the politics of the new climatic regime, which is the fact that it's no coincidence that the global turn towards market fundamentalism that has been a major factor in the rise of global inequality happened at exactly the same time that scientists and the public started learning about the effects of climate change. And in his book, Down to Earth, Bruno Latour argues that these are just two sides of the same coin, which are the process by which the owners of capital and major businesses, and in particular the fossil fuel industry, stopped viewing themselves as inhabiting a shared world with the rest of humanity. And in a way, this was the attempt over the last for decades by the owners of capital to overcome the limits to growth that were either imposed by national boundaries or even by planetary boundaries. And the importance of this is that we're living in a time when the globalization has led to such inequality that social democracy itself is falling apart. Capitalism cannot sustain itself because the social contract that was at the core of the Keynesian welfare state has disintegrated. And the result is the simultaneous rise of fascism all over the world. And history is repeating itself. This is nothing new. The great historians Hannah Arendt and Karl Polanyi warned about this a century ago, where you have the political alienation of the working classes leading to essentially the fertile grounds for demagoguery and the rise of populists who find scapegoats for people's anger. So what does this all mean for what we're here to talk about today? My point that I really think is very important is that we cannot focus only on fighting disinformation because we would be missing the bigger picture. What we are living through is the commodification of the mind, the human mind, in the same way that the Industrial Revolution was the commodification of labor. And what that means is we must assert control over the technologies that control us. In order to fight to retain control of the access to information, we as the users of networks that are controlled by these 5 men you see on the screen must undergo a process of collective identity formation that is more or less analogous to the creation of the working class in the 19th century. And if this does not happen, then these tech oligarchs will always be able to manipulate the public, to hand select our leaders and manipulate our behavior. And then it won't be long before we start turning on each other, and in some ways we already have. So I want to end my presentation with the quote that from the great Brazilian activist Chico Mendes, which is that environmentalism without class struggle is just gardening. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Gareth. That is why I opened up with a bit of a reason for optimism, because I think when we're studying this kind of thing, there are so many scary reasons for pessimism as well. And I do share a lot of the concerns that you are commenting on there, and certainly look forward to a bit more discussion on some of those topics. Thank you very much. Sherilee, would you like to go next? Are you all set?
Yes. All right. So thanks so much. It's such a pleasure to be here today. The presentations so far have been very fascinating. I've loved them. So yeah, I'm a professor at the University of Alberta. But today I'd really like to talk to you from my, I guess like my other hat that I wear, which is one of the vice chairs for Working Group 1 in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So the IPCC is a UN organization. It sits under the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environmental Program. And the job or the mandate of the IPCC is to assess, scientific understanding of climate change. It's often considered to be, like the gold standard in terms of evidence assessment. If you, want to know something about climate change, it's a pretty comprehensive peer-reviewed process. Yeah. So just looking at some of the, the findings or the overarching findings of some of the recent reports that have been published from the IPCC, I think, everyone that's probably joining on this call would agree with the statement on the screen, which sort of summarizes one of the key findings from the Impacts and Adaptation Report, which was published in 2022. Basically, we know that the climate is changing, and we know that it poses a particular threat to human health and well-being and health of the planet, and we need to start taking action now. As a health researcher, one of the most interesting findings to me was, climate change impacts every aspect of our life, but it also impacts our health. And I also noticed that there are several people on the call from the health sector. So I know that they'll agree with me when I say, climate change has impacted, the health of millions of people around the world, probably including each and every one of us, I would even argue. And in the report, we had assessed a variety of different types of health impacts, ranging from waterborne disease to foodborne disease, vector-borne disease, heat-related morbidity and mortality, air pollution, malnutrition. And a new addition in this last report was an assessment of mental health, which we hadn't done before in past reports. So the health impacts are pretty, wide, sweeping, and can be quite severe. And we've seen that even unfold within our own country in Canada. But there's also interesting research showing that if you frame climate change as a health issue, it helps to inspire action or change. And this research comes from the United States, but I think that it might play out true in Canada as well, that if you frame climate change as a health issue, you inspire more action than if you frame it just as an environmental issue or just as an economic issue or just as a national security issue. So this health angle in terms of framing climate change can be really helpful. Now, that said, we know in the health sector all about misinformation and disinformation. This is something that the health sector has been struggling with literally for decades, with some really loud voices that have really resulted in so in some cases pretty catastrophic health outcomes for certain people and certain populations. So this is something that the health sector is faced with and has been dealing with for quite some time. So I guess that leads to my next question is, so what does the IPCC say about misinformation in the last assessment cycle? In the last assessment cycle, we assessed tens of thousands of articles, a ton of literature on climate change, but what was said about misinformation? And surprisingly, I have to say, not very much. So these reports were published from 2021 to 2023, and it ranged from not assessing it or even mentioning misinformation or disinformation at all, which was the case for the synthesis report. It was mentioned but not really assessed in the mitigation report or Working Group 3 report, and it was assessed in Working Group 2. But it was only really mentioned in 2 chapters and assessed fully in 1 chapter. And the chapter that assessed it fully, interestingly, was the North American chapter. And that's maybe because there's more literature for this region. I'm not sure. So what did the North American chapter say about mis and disinformation? There was several pages dedicated to this, but I've included 2 excerpts on the screen. The top bolded one was included in the executive summary for the chapter. And basically it's saying that, misinformation has not only undermined climate science, but it's also actually, delayed action and delayed our ability to adapt. So what can we do about it? Andrew had challenged us to talk about that. And so I pulled out some of the things that were assessed in the North American chapter in the IPCC Working Group 2 report. And these are some of the things that they said, but there wasn't a lot of depth to this. Reducing psychological distance from the issue, trying to communicate in a way that's personalized and local, avoiding instilling fear or dread and trying to pull on strings of hope and optimism, perhaps. Understanding different typologies. For example, in the US, they use this different typologies of people produced by Yale, that kind of groups people as alarmed, concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, or dismissive. And I guess in terms of good news is that the dismissive group is actually the smallest minority, but perhaps one of the most vocal groups that exist. So I think, to me, as somebody who in this next 7th assessment cycle, who sits as one of the vice chairs, I think it's a really important opportunity for us to address this issue better in the next set of assessment reports. We've just launched the 7th assessment cycle, and there's clearly, a lot more research being done in this area and being published in this area. It clearly didn't have a full treatment in terms of assessment in the last reports. And it's a really critical topic that we should try to address better. And I think this is important because the IPCC reports aren't just another UN report or aren't just another, scientific report. These reports are the reports that are meant or intended to underpin decision-making during international climate change negotiations, including at the COPs, which 2 of the past presenters mentioned, where governments from around the world come together to negotiate climate change agreements and deals. And if you look at the decision text in those negotiations, the IPCC is referred to in many different places. So it is an opportunity to try and bring this discourse or some of these ideas into that decision-making arena. So yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, and thank you so much for that. I mean, my background is in political science, so I think too often I myself ignore the health side of climate change, and I think that's often really why we care about it, right? Our lives, and I think you're right that not only is our health already being impacted, but by some measurements, I think that more lives are being lost every year due to health-related issues when you add them all up that are being exacerbated by climate change. So certainly something important to keep in our conversations about disinformation and climate change. Thank you. Chris.
Yeah, thanks. This has been great. It's been so nice to be among such interesting, thoughtful people. Appreciate the effort to develop, a long form conversation around this that you guys at the lab have been doing. It's been 2 years since we did a day-long workshop on this at Carleton, and I guess a little over 6 months since we released a report on wildfire and misinformation in Canada's climate conversation. And I'm struck, like in my day-to-day, at the range of people now experiencing and thinking about this and trying to have conversations about this as a problem. Journalists, activists, media monitoring groups, parents, school where my kids go, students, crisis comms people, emergency responders, public health people, other academics. And so I like that this is expanding and that maybe there's a diverse range of circumstances and situations and contexts that this work can speak to. I think I'll just throw 4 points in the mix. One, I do think it helps to differentiate research on climate disinformation and to differentiate approaches to identifying and making sense of false, misleading information. Critical intellectual approaches that involve historians are different from governance regulatory approaches that involve primarily lawyers and politicians. That's different again from professionals that have worked in trust and safety, often within platforms, and it's different again from those addressing foreign interference and national security. And so it isn't all one thing. And I think that can just be helpful to remember sometimes, especially if we wade into sort of the big D, big disinformation that can get reified as an idea in the big D discourse that circulates around this. Our approach has really been to try to stay abreast of cognitive and fact-checking oriented approaches while thinking that the problem does need to be approached from a social sense-making and engagement perspective of the sort that Kate Starberg and her colleagues have really done. So I think these things need to be thought through together as approaches, at least coming at this from a communication perspective. Second point, it's about fossil fuels. Quick +1 to Gareth's point about the importance of that sector and carbon majors. It's not only governments that go to these COPs, the fossil fuel sector shows up en masse. And so attending to the ways that they communicate to build the identifications and social license necessary for them to persist, in addition to everything else they do, this is a consistent through line across the decades, despite shifts in strategy and story. And this is all pretty well documented. It's not all that novel and new maybe as a story, but still super important, I would say, to prioritize, and has really underpinned our interest in working through greenwashing as a problem, along with some of the things Gareth was talking about. Third point, information environment. There's just some really important and different elements to the current situation that involve the organization of our information environment, especially by very large digital platforms. And this has consequences for how we connect, share content, form relationships, mobilize each other, make sense of our day-to-day. It's such a big issue that no one working on climate and energy should ignore anymore. So I think we do have to help people understand the architecture of this information environment that's boosted an influencer class, including political elites, that's not only changed the mix of reliable, unreliable information, but how influence and power operate today. So we need a better analytic for people that they can use to understand influencer aesthetics and culture and the business incentives that drive that, the technical design choices and the business models they reflect, algorithmic moderation, curation, recommendation systems, the ad tech industry and its behavioral modification programs. That's all crucial, but especially I would say the participatory nature of crowd dynamics and social sense making in the peer-to-peer systems we have. I think the far right understands and adapts to this much better than most of us have, and this just needs to be a bigger part of what we're thinking about. Now, unfortunately, this is way harder to do than I realized 2 years ago, and in no small part to the obstruction of research into the online environment by platforms that have decided visibility into what's happening in their systems isn't a good business decision for them, at least the 5 guys that were shown there in Gareth's slide. And so I actually feel that the internet's less transparent and visible than at any time previous before. I'm hoping my friends here at U of O and McGill and TMU and UBC might disabuse me of that, but people are desperate just for visibility into how our online information environment's organized and how that's shaping climate conversations. So the good part is I think it's producing a wider reflection on tech power and policy. Organizations are talking about this. They're having conversations about leave Meta, stay at Meta, how to get involved in tech policy, online harms conversations. I think this is all stuff to be encouraged in this space. Last point, this information environment shaping the climate conversation in Canada has changed in a big way since and during the pandemic. So this has already been mentioned, but the anti-government narrative that surged online during the pandemic to oppose government measures around masks, vaccines, mobility, which many of us understood as necessary public health measures, were framed by a small group of actors as acts of a broken, deranged, wacko, proto-authoritarian government controlled by elites using crisis to overreach its bounds. So that narrative is part of a sense-making process that acknowledged and validated the pain people were feeling, their isolation, their suffering, their insecurity, provided a community and invited them to join in building a narrative against the perceived cause, which landed primarily on government. Now, the influencers, networks, and audiences invested in that narrative did not go away with the decline of the pandemic, as we've heard, or the removal of public health restrictions. They have incorporated climate and net zero issues, retrofitted the narratives to incorporate climate emergency into a framework built to challenge pandemic emergency, and are readily pulling climate program solutions and policies into this deep story of a broken democracy or deranged government implementing policies out of touch with the people. Green Deal, Green New Deal, IRA, net zero, but also just very tangible, pragmatic, local interventions into EV policies, wind and solar installations, this kind of thing. And so this is a really large problem, and I'd give you a few quick examples if we want to talk a little bit more how that lands. But to wrap this up, this broken gov theory or argument or story or, open set of evolving ways of world building isn't itself, disinformation, but it's the deep story or narrative ground that the feelings and tropes around this is incubating and re-radiating out a lot of misinformation, especially during moments of crisis. So I think we need to see this collective sense-making process. I don't think it's as a sense-making process. I don't think it's happenstance that the most intense moments are crises and emergencies associated with climate impacts when we see the surge of this. These are key focusing events when people are sorting out their relationship to climate change more generally. So understanding this is an affective and narrative terrain on which a lot of what we communicate will be heard and circulate, at least in Canada and the parts of Canada I'm most familiar with, will be just a big part of what we're dealing with going forward. So I'm going to leave it there. It's been great to be part of this conversation. I look forward to what's next.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you to all the panelists for that. One thing that I think about a lot and that I've been kind of sharing with my students, actually, I find is that increasingly multidisciplinarity has become kind of this buzzword. I think that when all of us are applying for grants, scholarships, maybe even job opportunities, there's often now a requirement for why or how is this project multidisciplinary? And then I think so often the buzzword becomes just a buzzword and not actually enacted in practice. And I think part of the conversations today are kind of demonstrating the actual importance of thinking through these challenges through an actual multidisciplinary function, because we can sit here in our room and think very specifically about climate disinformation, which is kind of where I come at a lot of these issues. But one of the things that I took away from all of our panelists so far is all of these issues are so interrelated to a lot of the big issues we're facing in society. And I think each of the panelists in their own way spoke about the really unsettling way that society and our ability to govern ourselves is kind of breaking down in the way Gareth mentioned, alongside our climate. We know the climate is breaking down, and so is our society, so is our ability to effectively govern ourselves, and so is our social fabric. And that's why I think that really digging into these issues and trying to find solutions to the issue specifically of climate disinformation, not only will hopefully that help us stave off some of the worst of climate change, and that is a significant issue, but I think if we can more effectively contribute to this healthy information ecosystem and push back against these broader issues that are sort of tearing apart our social fabric, the more effectively we'll be able to govern health outcomes, prevent future pandemics, have healthy environmental ecosystem, minimize the divide between the left and right, the urban and rural, and maybe even the global north and south that we're seeing more and more. So again, I really thank you all for those super interesting insights and looking forward to digging in all of those a bit more. As mentioned, I will invite the audience at this point to start raising your Zoom hands. I think what we will do is probably start by collecting a few questions. So a reminder to, once we bring you into the room to pose your question, to briefly introduce yourself and very briefly pose your question. And they can be general thoughts, questions, concerns to the whole panel or to specific panelists if you'd like. And we'll probably collect 2 or 3 of those at a time. And while people are taking a minute to put up your hands, I will just ask Nico, who's one step ahead of me, to share his screen and walk us through the MIRO board as well. So as we are taking the sort of in-person visual oral questions, everybody will be able to continue contributing to the MIRO board. And I see many people already have. So thank you very much for that. We are kind of taking participation from a couple of layers and really planning to share this MIRO board with everyone else, with everyone after. So Nico, did you want to just give us a very brief explanation so that everybody is aware of how to use it? Though I see everybody seems to be doing a great job already.
Yeah, so hi everyone. So the MIRO board that I just shared in the chat is supposed to serve as a shared space for brainstorming and collaboration. It's meant to help us track in a structured way some of the insights, challenges, and ideas that have come up so far today. You can think of the board as a visual trace and ultimately an englobing summary and a common resource that we can refer back to and build on as we move forward. So to keep things a bit organized, we've set up a few categories for today's first session. These categories are from left to right. So the first one related to vulnerabilities to climate disinformation. Second, sources of resilience and trust. Then it's opportunities to collaborate or innovate. And finally, unanswered questions or knowledge gaps. There's also an other category for anything that doesn't fit neatly into the other categories. So if you'd like to contribute, adding a sticky note should be pretty quick and easy. And here's how you do it. So after you've clicked the link in the Zoom chat, and I see many of you have already, this will open the MIRO board in a new browser window. And once you're in, you'll see that there are 2 work areas. You can zoom in on the one that's on the left for session 1. So to add your input, and after having had a look at what's there, the first step is to figure out the category that best fits the input that you want to share. And at that point, you click on the sticky note icon that's on the left-hand toolbar. It's the square icon that has a folded corner on the bottom right of the square. Next step is to pick a color. It doesn't have to be an exact match of the column. So I'll just pick maybe a blue one. And then you can just click anywhere inside the category or column where your input fits best. So I'm going to click on the blue one here. And here at this point, you type in your idea, your comment, your question. It's best to keep it short and clear if possible. So think around relationality. And you can then drag and drop to adjust the placement further if needed. So as you can see, it's pretty much just a click and type process. You can add as many as you'd like throughout the session. This is really an opportunity to bring in your expertise, your experiences, your ideas. Everything that's added here will help to shape the themes and priorities for the upcoming Climate Misinformation Summit in June. A rule of thumb, I think, just don't overthink it too much. Whether it's a quick thought, a challenge you see, or a useful resource that maybe you're familiar with, all contributions are valuable. We'll be keeping an eye on the board throughout the session, and later on during the debrief, we'll try to highlight some of the contributions that emerge. And with that, I'll hand it back to Andrew to kick off the Q&A.
Thank you so much for that, Nico, and thank you for everybody sharing your thoughts on there. As mentioned, we really want to hear your thoughts and questions as much as possible orally here to share with our participants, but we definitely want to have them in this MIRO board as well. And we are going to be referring this for our future research and as we are continuing to frame our road to the summit and beyond. And as mentioned, we will be sharing it with you as well. So hopefully this ends up being a really useful resource for everyone. And with that, we have a few questions already coming in the chat, which we can start with, but I also welcome people to raise their digital hands. And I've got almost limitless questions, and I could take up the next 3 hours with these panelists, but I will defer to some of the audience for now. So the first question is for Professor Carignan. You mentioned a similarity between pandemic and climate discourses with passports and confinement. Do you see the same actors involved in both spheres? And are the pandemic conspiracy theorists that are involved in climate change topics, are they mostly different influencers? And I think this is a really important question that speaks, again, to that question of, I don't know if it's the right term, but multidisciplinarity, which I think so often we think of as kind of this cross-disciplinary exercise that happens within universities and across our disciplines. But I think we see the same kinds of things happen out in society. So I'm really interested in hearing more about that as well. The overlap that exists out there of these disinformation campaigns and their negative outcomes on climate change, on health, maybe on democracy, and more. Did you want to start us off with that?
Yeah, and thank you for the question and for your comment, Andrew. And I think it also go close to what Chris was presented in his initial remarks. He also observed the same thing, I think, about this kind of link. So my introducing remarks was really focused on a Quebec project that we conduct with the UNESCO Pref Chair. But what we see is that I will say in the French ecosystem, because what we were looking at, it was really focused on Quebec influencers online, but these influencers are really also active in France and in Belgium. We share like the same French ecosystem. There's a specific French ecosystem, I think, different than, for example, US influencers who share information and also have an effect in the English part of Canada, but it's a different ecosystem. So for the French ecosystem, yeah, clearly we saw the same influencer sharing disinformation about climate change, that they were the same, a part of them at least was the same, sharing some disinformation about the pandemic. And even if I thought it's a good thing to have question about different political decision to manage the pandemic, and we can have question about different social action that the government have taken in the pandemic, but now it was really disinformation. So it was really false information about the pandemic and the like the hidden agenda of the government or scientific media, etc. And yeah, these influencers, we saw the same in the French ecosystem, sharing disinformation about different conflicts, for example, Russia, yeah, and also different conflict. They share a lot of information about USA and Donald Trump, and now they share a lot of disinformation about climate change. So there's a link, and I think the link is really political and economic. Sometimes other interests that are really difficult to identify or be sure, but yeah, they are the same. And I think they are close to different influencers in the US ecosystem. So I was talking about influencers who share this information, but for sure, I also agree with what Gareth just said, that some of these influencers have direct link with different companies, because we saw this also. There's an ecosystem in the French ecosystem where there's group like fossil group, pro-fuel group, and some of them are ideological group like right-wing group like Québec Fier, and they have a direct funding from different fossil industry. So there's a link, but they were also the same who were having a lot of questions about the pandemics. Yeah. I don't know, maybe my colleague want to jump in, because I think Chris talked about it also.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was just going to suggest, I mean, Chris, you mentioned a bit on that, and certainly Sherilee, you spoke about the health dynamics as well. Did either of you want to jump in on that?
Why don't you go ahead, Sherilee?
We're so politely Canadian, because I was going to say the same thing to you. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think just like a general overarching remark is that I think that we have a lot to learn from the health sector in terms of misinformation, because they've been dealing with this like even longer than we've been studying climate change. I think they have some like helpful things to offer. But they're still learning too. I mean, some of the things that happened during the pandemic, I don't think that any health researcher would have guessed would happen. Things are just so much more extreme now and so different. But I think that there are some, like things that we can learn across those two groups, because as we saw in the presentation, a lot of the arguments, a lot of the language, a lot of the thinking behind it, a lot of the vested interests behind some of these things are very common between the two topics, between health and climate change.
If I could just add something briefly to that, I agree with all this. I mean, if I can use a quick example from the LA fires, where you had all manner of nonsense, right? All the tropes and theories, weather controls, space lasers, QAnon. I'm sure most of this crowd saw it.
EDI as well.
Yeah, yeah, but I think it's in some ways the lesser known ones that I saw signaling the bigger problem. So this idea that endangered fish protected by environmental policies were the reason there wasn't enough water or state support, or a lesser known one even about the story about impeded fire trucks from Oregon that were allegedly stopped in California to undergo emissions testing, which they couldn't pass. So assistance from LA, a city in crisis, was held up to emissions policies in a state associated with climate action. So pretty misleading, but part of the wider ways in which people kind of quickly during crisis were making sense of this. And it was the Oregon fire trucks one that I think it initiated by a guy who got a rumor from his brother, somehow connected to the fire department, about trucks being stopped. The trucks were stopped. They were given a quick maintenance inspection before driving into Lord knows what kind of situation, which seems like a pretty good idea for equipment going a longer way than usual to navigate a hellscape. But the guy with the brother somehow quickly got to the idea that inspection meant emissions testing, meant the way California regulates this stuff, and saw environmental and climate policies as detached from the reality of the situation and being applied by out-of-touch government officials. So this is interesting to me because if you're on Team Fact Check, you'll like what happened next, which is authorities came up, debunked it. Textual visual fact check spoke to media, all very clear. The original poster took down the post as a result, apologized for misleading content. But of course, meso-level influencers trawling for evidence and content used it to like turn this into an engagement opportunity for far-right ideological attacks on government, and lifted engagement that way. But the reason I think this is an interesting story beyond what we've heard about how COVID and climate have intersected is that this kid seemed to have no malign intentions. Somehow news of a maintenance check meant to him broken government, and he filled that up with the idea that this was an environmental climate emissions policy that was like at the heart of this. And so without any real ideologically or professional grievance grifter make money intentions, he just kind of quickly got there. And this is the alarming thing to me, is that climate related and climate adjacent programs and solutions, in the way that public health was during the pandemic and perhaps still today, is just kind of quickly being dragged into building this story among a wider group of people and like re-radiating it out. So that I think is as crucial as like connecting the dots back to fossil fuel funding industries, which we understand what they're about. Hopefully everyone here understands what they're about, is like dealing with the ways in which people that you wouldn't connect back to those networks are part of this issue.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Gareth. I know we didn't bring you in yet, but we do have a number of questions coming in. So I will keep inviting people to put up their Zoom hands, and we'll bring you into the room to pose a question. Jenny, I see you in the room here. Did you want to maybe turn on your camera and speaker or microphone and pose your question? And then I might loop in a couple from the chat as well, and then give all the panelists an opportunity to respond to the group of comments as well.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Andrew. And thank you for everyone for this really important panel. I've been taking notes like crazy and learning a lot, so thank you. My question is mainly inspired by the introduction that you gave, Sherilee, but I'm sure that other panelists will have interesting thoughts on this as well. So you mentioned this question of, we have this problem, what can we do? And I was curious about two of the points that you mentioned. The first being this idea of reducing psychological distance. Excuse me. And I was just curious what exactly is meant by that. And how might that look, I guess, practically, like maybe an example or something like that. And then the second one, this idea of avoiding fear and dread and drawing instead on things like optimism and hope. And I think that's so important and so interesting. And I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more to that. Are there, specific examples that have worked really well, strategies, studies that show, yes, this type of thing works, this type of thing doesn't? Just anything you kind of want to add there.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, I'm just going to add one in, Sherilee, just before you respond so we can get to a few more. Thank you so much for that question, Jenny. And I like this next question posed in the chat by Dev Minotra, partly because it speaks to the paper that we put out and kind of how we're framing this workshop with the idea of whole of society approaches. And the question is, what form would a whole of society approach take to tackle mis/disinformation? Would it be a nonprofit group? Would it constitute committees and recurring annual meetings? Is there a timeline in mind to establish it? So I know that you all here, the panelists, have not argued specifically for a whole of society approach, but if you do think that this sort of thing is appropriate, I mean, can you speak a bit to this question? Again, this is, I think, sort of asking what should these solutions look like coming from each of your various expertise? And then maybe we'll start with Sherilee and Gareth can follow, and then we'll go to the other panelists for a response to both of those questions.
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, thank you for the question. I think, thinking about psychological. So first of all the things that I listed on the slide were suggested as like potential like solutions. At the same time, it was sort of like the jury was still out in terms of like what's most effective or the evidence behind it. I think that has changed a lot since 2022. So I'd be curious to know what the other panelists think about that. But the psychological distance from the topic. So it's sort of this idea that climate change is happening somewhere far away, like in a faraway place or in a faraway time. So like, climate change is only impacting like African countries, for example. It's not really hit Canada yet. Or, climate change is a concern, but it doesn't really concern Canadians until like 2050 or like maybe end of century. But I think we started to see that change a lot. I know like me, I'm from Ontario, but I moved to Alberta in 2018. And it was sort of like this rude awakening in terms of the climate change discourse out here. But I do find that talking about things like climate hazards, like wildfires, which are, here have been attributed to climate change very clearly, as a great way to open the door to that conversation. And so when people are experiencing these climate change impacts themselves, it reduces that psychological distance. It's like no longer something that's happening in faraway timescales or faraway locations. It's happening to them. And it impacts them and their family and their pets and their community and their kids. Like these are all things that I try to touch on when I'm talking to people to try and reduce that psychological distance. And I think that like in my unstudied, very anecdotal experience talking to media and community in Alberta, I think it helps. So for example, like bringing climate change into the discussion. So, whenever there's like some sort of weather event, like a heat wave or a wildfire, oftentimes the media will reach out to me to want to talk about it. And instead of just talking about it as like a health issue, I talk about it as like a climate health issue. And like this is not just a conversation about a heat wave. This is a conversation about climate change, and trying to bring that in whenever I can. Yeah. I forgot what the second question was though. So anyways, I'll turn it over to my colleagues to touch on those.
Thank you so much for those thoughts, Sherilee. Gareth, did you want to jump in on any of the questions that have been posed so far and share a few more thoughts?
Could you also reiterate the second question? I was thinking about the one that Sherilee just answered because I'd like to answer both.
Yeah. What form would a whole of society approach to tackle misinformation look like? Would it be a nonprofit, committees? What would the timeline be? I mean, again, as I said, I know that you guys didn't come here necessarily organizing this, but what can this whole of society approach actually look like?
Right. So Thank you for these questions. On the topic of psychological distance, there's a resource that I would direct everyone to that I find very often useful when working with other NGOs, which is the product of research done by the Project Energy Coalition with billions of data points. And the title of the report that they wrote, which is very simple, is called "How to Talk About Climate Change Like a Human." And I'm sure many people in the room probably have seen it before, but it's actually quite interesting, being someone that has so deeply embedded in the world of IPCC reports and IEA and net zero, that when you disembed yourself from that bubble, you start to realize that it can sound quite alienating to people that aren't familiar. And so there are some very useful tools that they have in that toolkit about what it looks like to basically do what Andrew was saying at the beginning, which is meet people where they're at. And then this also might sound like a flippant metaphor, but bear with me. I have a friend that is in the climate movement, but does a lot of organizing. And she often describes it as that, like, climate people are still the sort of nerds in high school that have this thing they're really interested in, but haven't really figured out how to connect with their peers and with regular people. And so it's sort of like, it's this kind of, it's not only a messaging problem, there's also like lots of affective and discursive components to it as well. And this leads me to my second point, which I think is extremely important, which is that I feel like until now have really overindulged on the idea that science and rationality are, in this Enlightenment model of democracy, are what drive societies and public opinions and public policy and all that kind of stuff. And the reality is that we are being completely out-organized in terms of narrative and storytelling. And the reality is that we win the climate culture war with better stories and better emotions and not necessarily better facts. And I think that's getting at the point that the commentator was saying, where there's really a need to paint a positive vision of the future and inspire hope in a way that doesn't create feelings of alarmism or guilt or feelings that tend to get people to shut down, and then also create anger by pointing out the people that are rightfully to blame for the anxieties that everybody is experiencing. And so an example of that would be that the fossil fuel industry, for example, was responsible for something like 40% of economy-wide inflation since 2022. But the reality is that that should be much more central to our messaging as a movement, because I saw even one statistic that was like upwards of 70% of Republican voters would have supported a windfall profits tax on oil companies because they thought it was an example of theft from the public. And these are the kinds of sentiments that exist that we can tap into that can really be sort of directed in a pro-climate direction, but we have to figure out how to sort of speak to people in a way that feels authentic to them. And sometimes, and this is the difficult part, that might mean not even centering climate change in our messaging.
Thank you for that. We're sort of running out of time already, so I've got a few more questions here, about 4 questions that sort of speak to the questions of tech and how disinformation is increasingly being put out there, and kind of also speaks to that broader question of what would a whole of society approach look like as well. So I'm going to really kind of summarize and pare down a few questions that we've had in the chat. While disinformation is usually overt and easily identifiable, which we can potentially debate, large language models will have a much more subtle and perhaps undetectable influence in how ideas are shaped and expressed. We're basically going to see more types of disinformation targeted to more types of individuals and people. Have any of you seen any promising approaches for how to deal with this relatively new threat that is developing? Along those lines, how do you encourage people to consume accurate information without resorting to censorship? How can we establish credible centers of information? And what are the most effective ways to debunk climate misinformation at scale? And I think those all kind of pose or tie to that question of what does a whole of society approach look like? Any of the panelists want to take in those now 4 or 5 or 6 kind of percolating questions that we have on the go? Chris or Marie-Ève, did you want to jump in on there since you didn't get in on the last round?
Yeah, I can jump in. Well, maybe I have 2 main points, but it will join what Sherilee and Gareth just said before. But yeah, in our research, what we found is that to fight misinformation and disinformation, what is really important is listening first. So it's really important to understand what makes people believe some false information and what bring them to believe that. So it's important to listening because sometimes it starts with emotion. So when we talk about the importance to understand what people are feeling, it's really important because we can take them from that moment and bring them back to a different conversation if they feel understood and if they feel that they have the right to feel different feelings or emotions. So it's really important to have a direct dialogue with the people to make them feel concerned. So in that point, I really share the same point that Sherilee just said before, because yeah, our research showed that direct dialogue really work well. And that's why when I was presenting our research at the beginning, I thought about the different kind of dialogue that we want to try, because we saw that maybe non-blaming communication could work really well. So the work what we did with IKTA right now is to find some way to communicate about different solutions and importance to have some different action, but in a non-blaming way, because if you blame and the people feel frustrated or not listen, it's not a good way to have that dialogue. So I think we really need to listen, and yeah, we will not win that fight with, I don't know, with blame and with the fact. We also need to work with emotion. And about the censorship question, I think it's a good one. And I'm a bit frustrated in the last few weeks, because what we heard about fact-checking isn't true. When I'm sure you listen on what Zuckerberg said about the fact-checking, but fact-checking isn't censorship. Fact-checking is showing sources and make them in context so people could choose what they want to believe, but they have different sources that validate or invalidate some information. So it's really near from censorship. And I think saying that fact-checking is censorship is a kind of manipulation to just avoid to respect some rules and being just unresponsible of what you are sharing online and of your algorithm. So I think fact-checking is important, but fact-checking work with some people that just are unsure about different information. So the people who really believe in this information will not be joined back by fact-checking. You have to find other way to join them. But for the people who are unsure about an information, I think fact-checking is a good thing. And yeah, it's not censorship, but I think that we have to think about how we could manage these platforms right now, because yeah, it's really a free-for-all right now, and it's really concerning. We saw an increase of disinformation on X, for example, since Musk had this platform, and it's a problem. We cannot say that it's not a problem. It's really a problem. And so yeah, we have to think about solution for the social platform for sure. And I don't have a good answer, because I think government have to act, and Canada is not powerful enough to work by his own. You have to work with different countries and different organizations to have make some pressures on these platforms. Yeah, sorry, that's my personal view, and not really the chair, but yeah, I'm a bit concerned right now about these platforms.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marie-Ève. I share your concern about those platforms, and I think that's a really important distinction to make, right? By pushing back on these kinds of information, by fact-checking, it doesn't mean that it's censorship, right? And I think that in this, there's an important place for expertise to be able to differentiate between what is fake news and not. Chris, can you share some thoughts on some of those questions as well?
Yeah, first of all, just the people in my group at Reclimate will kill me if I don't say this. So we have Canadian-specific stuff on audience segmentation and talking like a human, and they'll kill me if I don't mention that we're not the 51st state yet, and we can look at some of our Canadian-based stuff and speak to people there too. +1 to the it's not censorship discussion on fact-checking, but I wouldn't say it that way. I would just say it's a free speech, consistent thing. It's more speech, right? Adding more stuff to the conversation in a lot of ways. I guess if fact-checking is used as a moderation tool that we don't have access to, you could kind of start to motivate that kind of conversation. But I think it goes to and this would be my response to the AI question as well, is that there are some very clear time-tested ways of regulating for transparency and accountability that are not regulating content. And I think getting visibility into design, getting visibility into what's happening in the way some of the EU policies have pursued would be a big step forward and completely consistent with free speech and transparency and disclosing to people kind of what's going on with their speech or their content or that kind of thing. And that is absolutely like a tool we shouldn't abandon because we don't think governments are strong enough to kind of do that. So we've had an online harms conversation here in Canada. It got to a reasonably good place. I don't know that it'll ever kind of get pushed forward because there's going to be an election, but we shouldn't lose the momentum and the kind of public conversation and the real feelings and passions and emotions and events and harms that drove that forward. I think that's kind of a crucial thing to continue doing. The whole of society thing, I think, is also a timeline one, right? Like in some ways, this is a generational issue as well as a whole of society issue. And so my mind goes to longer term perspectives. Local journalism is something people keep coming back on as a crucial thing. We can't do that tomorrow or in 3 weeks, but we can restore local journalism to communities and have a public-facing, publicly owned, publicly supported information environment. That can be done. That's not some impossible thing that should lie outside our political imaginary. And I think that's just a crucial place to go for how to restore information integrity. People want timely, local, accurate, usable information. Local journalism gives you that, but it's also the way a community has a conversation with itself. So I think there's those longer term things that are on longer timescales that we need to deal with beyond the immediate things that bump up. And that's a solution I think would be great if people could kind of have a wider conversation about.
Absolutely. I agree with so much of what you said. And I mean, if I were to boil down it into just a few words, I mean, I would say that we have to keep having ambition and keep working towards this kind of stuff, right? We can't just put up our hands. We can't be apathetic about it. And we do need to keep working and pursuing means to these ends. We're almost out of time, but Gareth and or Sherilee, did you guys want to offer some kind of final closing thoughts on any of the questions that were posed there?
Sure. I would just say, as we think about transforming media ecology in the world, there are so many movements that are for the creation of a digital commons, and there's the platform cooperativism consortium. There's groups like the Electronic Frontier Foundation. There's all kinds of the peer-to-peer foundation. There's all kinds of groups that exist to use the internet as it was originally supposed to be designed as this sort of a way to exchange information freely among people without the artificial scarcity of large capitalist monopolies. And I do think that we can create that world if we so choose. We just have to fight for it.
Thank you very much for that. I mean, I think that is a mildly optimistic note to end on. Everybody, please joining me in thanking the panelists so much for all of your thoughts, and thank you everybody for your questions. Unfortunately, we only got to a fraction of the questions. There's so many interesting thoughts there. Everybody, please add not only your thoughts, but your questions also to the MIRO board. As mentioned, we realize that we have known unknowns, but also unknown unknowns. So we do welcome your questions, and we will keep considering those questions and hope that everybody will keep thinking about these questions and answers over the coming months and years as well. So thank you again to the panelists. We will take a quick break. We're down to about 13 minutes now, but if everybody wants to go grab yourself a coffee or water, I know a couple people have to move on for the day, and thank you again for your time. But for everyone who's able to stay, we look forward to seeing you in about 12 or 13 minutes, and then we will get going with the second panel for today's workshop. Thanks again so much, everyone. All right, everybody, welcome back. I think we might be about 30 seconds early, but we are going to get started right at 3 p.m. sharp here to make sure that we have as much time as possible for another robust discussion. Hopefully, most of you are with us for the first panel. It was super interesting, and I'm really looking forward to the second panel of our workshop this afternoon. I see we have all of our panelists with us. Again, we are going to have a similar enrollment of things as we did to the first time. So I'm going to start off by providing just a few more framing thoughts that are specific to the topics that we're going to be covering in this panel, which I think build logically from the first one, and then introduce our panelists. And we will again have very short 5 to 7 minute maximum presentations from the panelists, and then a robust Q&A session after. As a reminder to those of you who are here the first time or new people joining us, once we do engage in the Q&A, I will invite you to raise your Zoom hand. And those of you who are not yet in the room with us yet, you will then be invited into the room once you've raised your hand, and you will be able to actually pose your question orally to the group. And we really hope everyone can do that, because we do want as much human exchange in here as possible. And actually on the last panel, they mentioned human exchange and human connection with our smaller communities and close people to us being really key to preventing climate disinformation. So hopefully we can build that community in this room as well. That being said, if you prefer, there is a Q&A box that you can use as well to submit your questions via text, and we can collate those together and read them out to our panelists. And then we also have a MIRO board function. And again, many of you have already been using this. The link for the MIRO board will be shared in the chat, and my colleagues will give us a really brief run through again, right leading into the Q&A session, just so that everybody is aware of how to use that. The MIRO board function is going to be a bit of a digital approach to brainstorming, where we can all collate our questions, our answers, our suggestions, our thoughts. And that's something that we are going to keep, we are going to build on, and we are going to share with everyone here as well. So hopefully this workshop can be as productive for the panelists, for the attendees and participants, as it will be for us here at the Info Integrity Lab as well. So with that, with a bit of the housekeeping done, I will share my PowerPoint here once again, just to give a few framing thoughts, as mentioned, on this second panel. So with the first panel today, we talked about this issue of climate change disinformation, and really how we can go about integrating more well-informed people across society into approaches for dealing with this complex set of issues. The whole day today, the whole raison d'etre for this workshop and for our broader pathway to the summit is, again, thinking about practical solutions, policy responses, tools, whatever this can look like, to, as I mentioned in the previous panel, really move the needle on climate disinformation. I would hazard a guess that everybody that's involved here today, whether participating as a panelist or simply in the audience, has probably been to many talks over the past couple of years about the problems of disinformation, about the problems and concerns that the climate crisis is posing us. And we at the Info Integrity Lab have really been pushing towards thinking about how we can contribute. There is this dense network and web of organizations out there increasingly having these important conversations and increasingly working towards these important solutions. But again, we are entering this workshop with a humble approach, realizing that we don't know everything and we don't know what we don't know. So again, as I mentioned earlier, we have a framing set of questions that I will show on the next slide here momentarily, but that also frame really the second half of the report that we've used as a bit of a launching pad for today's event. And it's been shared in the chat earlier. I'm assuming my colleagues will share it again now, but it is available on our website. And I really welcome everybody to take a close look through this report if they have not already done so when they get a chance. But again, I will repeat what I mentioned at the start of the previous panel, because I do think it's important. We are really here not just to provide our expertise and share our information with you, but we are really here to gain from your expertise as well. The list of people that have signed up for this event, which are well over 100, are very impressive experts from all walks of life. I would maybe go so far as to say that we have whole of society experts here thinking about these complex issues. And through that, we really do want you to share your information. And we are certainly going to start with the expertise of the panelists and their thoughts. But beyond that, we really do want to have a constructive dialogue that is as useful for the panelists and the participants as it is for us. And part of that will be done through today's conversation here during the panel. But part of that also will be, as mentioned, through the MIRO board, which again, we will share with everyone else. So we welcome questions and comments at the end, posed orally with your video on, if you so desire. If not, you can send your questions via text. But we also hope that you will contribute these and additional thoughts to the MIRO board, because we do have limited time here, and we do want to make sure that today's discussion does live on. So thinking about practical solutions and policy responses, which is really what this second session is about and what the second half of the paper, the report framing document for this session is. I've already mentioned a couple times, there's really concerns about governing information. And there was a question posed in the previous or to the previous panel about how we push back, how we fact check, how we try to disaggregate fake news or disinformation from real news and real information, what is accurate and what is not, without getting to the point of trying to govern information or without getting to the point of trying to silence certain people. And this is really where the crux of this issue is at. We are trying to create and contribute to a healthy information ecosystem, but realizing that our ecosystem is as disaggregated and diverse as ever before, and more information is being inundated towards us than ever before. And as several of the panelists outlined in our previous panel, these campaigns tend to be extremely well funded and have been for decades, and in some cases, hundreds of years. One of our panelists did a great job of pointing to how this kind of thing has been around for hundreds of years. And really what has changed is the internet, and more recently, social media tools and platforms and their proliferation and our proliferating use of them. And this is what has really been able to weaponize this disinformation online. So we need to think about how we can mitigate those issues without being seen as silencing voices, without choosing who gets to have this voice or not, and by getting to have expertise increasingly heard and listened to, while also not pushing back further against people who, a lot of sectors of society have more and more disdain for expertise, for governance, and for authority in general. So in thinking about these practical solutions and policy responses that we want to get to, we always have to be aware of those tensions and tread very carefully when we are pushing really hard to push back against the problematic disinformation that is out there, to create and foster this healthy information ecosystem without being seen to muzzle or silence certain parts of society, and ensuring that we are meeting people where they are at. And part of meeting people where they are at, I think, is where I've come at this, and where I think the Information Integrity Lab comes at this, with suggesting that we need what we refer to as a whole of society approach, in understanding that it's not up to the government to fix this. It is not up to academics or think tanks or NGOs or individuals or journalists. It is about leveraging all of these factors of society and hoping that all of us can contribute to that effective and healthy information ecosystem without having one set of voices heard over the others. So rather than trying to silence tech platforms, though some have certainly become problematic, it's about collaborating with them and addressing the digital frontier that exists. We have to obviously engage with the public in general, increase awareness and education, but also by doing this, by empowering citizens rather than trying to funnel information down towards them. Part of this challenge, which was also spoken to by a couple of our panelists on the previous panel, is the real challenges that come with effective scientific communication. I think there's a lot of experts out there, many of ourselves included, who have thought about and studied these kinds of things for a long time and are pretty sure about what we know. But that doesn't mean that we've been effective at communicating it. And I think that we have been seeing this with the polarization of society, the failure of a lot of governments, and especially maybe more progressive parties that tend to be those more active in trying to effectively push back against the problems of climate change. But thinking about how we can effectively communicate the science that we know is around us, and whether it is in relation to vaccines and pandemics and health, or climate change and other environmental concerns out there. This notion of scientific communication, and I would say maybe to this point, our failure to effectively communicate the science that we have helped develop is one of those things that we have to think about in implementing these kinds of solutions, and communicating scientific findings through civil society initiatives, working with people, speaking in their languages, and again, meeting them where they are at. I think too often when we have these types of conversations, we think about public sector type things, whether this is education, institutions, universities, etc. But when at the end of the day, those are a small part of society. I mean, the biggest thing that people integrate with and engage with is private industry. And therefore, it's really important to be having these conversations, and including private industry as part of these conversations, to ensure that, for better or worse, our capitalistic mode of production is involved in contributing to this healthy information ecosystem. Because so far, I think that it's partly the capitalistic and profit motivated segments of the private industry that have really been driving disinformation. And therefore, we need to include this industry as well in these conversations. And of course, as part of all of this, I think we have to think about the role of journalism in all of this. Journalism, like many other facets of society, have been undergoing a number of overlapping crises in recent years. And I think we've seen our federal government here in Canada try to do some things to foster a healthier, profitable, sustainable journalistic ecosystem. And we can have a debate about the degree to which they've been successful in doing so. But for the most part, we are still seeing a crisis in journalism in general, and specifically probably as it relates to climate journalism. And part of this goes back to this need for effectively communicating scientific findings and healthy, accurate information in general. So these are just some of the aspects that I point towards in the paper. But we obviously need many, many more. I've mentioned a couple times that we really come at this from a place of humility, and we hope that our panelists here today and our those in the audience can help us think about more facets of this whole of society approach that can come together to help contribute to a more healthy ecosystem to this point, it seems we have largely been failing. I've added a few of the guiding questions here that appear at the end of many of the sections through the report. I hope, again, everybody will refer back to the report. People can consider these questions that I've added here while we are working through this first panel today. But one thing I'll echo again from the first panel is that we welcome your questions as well. We hope that people will look through these questions I'm sharing now, the questions that we will discuss today, and the thoughts people will contribute to the MIRO board. But also consider the questions that we pose throughout the report, and stay in communication with us. Reach out to us anytime if you have any thoughts on answering those questions. And more than that, if you have any questions that we are missing or not thinking about, those can really help us as well. So with that, we will go into our panel. And for our first panelist, we will go in order, and I'll give them a brief introduction here. We have Anatoliy Gruzd, who is the co-director of the Social Media Lab at Toronto Metropolitan University. After that, we will have Michael Khoo, who is co-founder of Uplift Strategies and co-chair of the Climate Action Against Disinformation Coalition. Following that, we will have Sonja Solomun, who is the deputy director at the Center for Media, Technology, and Democracy at McGill University. And our final panelist of the day will be Heidi Tworek, who is director of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions at the University of British Columbia. And as I mentioned during the first panel, I have said these bios as briefly as I possibly can so we can maximize our effective and constructive working time together. But all of these panelists have extremely impressive bios, and they are all posted online on the webpage for this event. And I welcome everybody in the audience to take some time to look a little bit more closely at the many accomplishments and accolades of our participants and panelists. So with that, I will turn it over to Anatoliy. Thank you so much for being here.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you, Andrew, for this introduction. It really sets the agenda for the session. Sounds like we need 30 hours, not 30 minutes for this, but actually for the opening remarks, we were given only 5 minutes, so I'll try to be brief. And I want to focus on one issue. It was touched on briefly earlier in the previous session, essentially the role of generative AI in producing climate disinformation, as well as the challenges associated with crisis communication in this context. Before I get into these opening remarks, let's just briefly watch deep fake, essentially showing fake fires during recent LA fires. The video was circulated largely online, and it's quite believable. As you watch this video, could you please use chat room to post how malicious actors might be using this video for what purposes? So I would like to see your ideas as we watch this video, how malicious actors, whoever they might be using this particular video. And so you can see, as technology becoming more and more realistic, it's sometimes very hard to differentiate between what's authentic, what it's not, especially when in this environment of uncertainty, where there's a large fire started somewhere, and you have this information overload of opinions, Photoshop images, and things like that. How do you know, what to believe? So I'm looking at some answers here. So thank you for posting them. So Angela saying to sow panic, distrust in the ability of the government to handle the situation, to undermine the reputation of firefighters. Exactly. Or disrupt certain events or agendas. So there's a wide range of ways malicious actor can use it, and it could be from anybody, from individuals just doing it for fun, to state actor who are actually trying to undermine the whole government. So today I want to talk on that topic of generative AI and what can we do about it, because Andrew really told us about focus on solutions. And where I'm coming from, I'm information scientist, and I co-lead social media lab at TMU, where we've been studying social media actually 14 years now. From 2010, where social media platforms have been viewed as positive, like force for good, to more recently, as we may see it as a malign tool for malicious actors, like the one generating videos like the one I showed you. At the Social Media Lab, in addition to doing computational science research, we also publish public reports on how Canadians use social media, as well as develop tools to support work of journalists. A lot have been mentioned about journalists, and they do need help to also get access to digital data and process it. So we're developing tools in the different contexts. During the COVID, we had various portals and dashboards to track and kind of fact check this and misinformation about COVID-19. More recently, we've been working on Russia-Ukraine related misinformation, as well as targeted ads. Sometimes we may think that if we know who paid for an ad, it's not going to be misleading or false on platforms like Meta, but you would be surprised how often false, misleading claims are hidden in the open, out in the open. And so related to deepfakes, specifically generative AI content, we launched this new portal, deepfakestracker.org. I'm just going to drop to the chat room link. When you have time, check it out. Essentially, it's information portal where we're trying to consolidate all the relevant resources for you to learn, as well as to get access to different tools to understand and study deepfakes. And so when we're talking about deepfakes, we have to acknowledge, of course, positive use and interesting, innovative applications of generative AI, from document analysis to helping us to write code. For businesses, it's a valuable tool in terms of marketing, entertainment, customer support, and even governments experimenting with citizen engagement through generative AI tools. So those are all interesting use cases. But we're really concerned here about the malicious actors, the negative use, harmful use of generative AI, from cyber threats to manipulation to scams to astroturfing. And you will say it's not new, like it was before generative AI, and I agree. But what's different here that Gen AI tools really reduce the cost of producing this information, and as a result, it increases the amount of it, so which makes it harder to fact check everything, or label everything, and it helps to accelerate that information, as making it more sticky, making it more persuasive by making it more personal, so personalizing to individuals, a group of users. And in the context of today's workshop, we're really concerned about weaponization of crisis communication with the use of generative tools. And we started this session when some of you posted examples how these tools can be used to exaggerate or downplay a risk, disrupt event, discredit local federal authorities, and criticize their responses. We've seen all of that's been happening, even recently, down south the border. And social media really fails to flag or block such content, and frankly, they're not interested in this. I understand the idea, Andrew opened this session in terms of trying to build coalition of stakeholders, but being in this for the last 14 years, I've seen efforts to build those coalitions, and unfortunately, it doesn't work because of completely different interests that different stakeholders on the industry side pursued. And we see it in actions. They will say they give a nice press release, but their action speaks otherwise. They fire, fact checkers. They stop content moderation of harmful content. So I think we have to look at other solutions, not just building coalitions. Fact-checking was mentioned last session, so I want to mention it here as well. It's crucial, I agree, but it's, again, no longer for priority for social media platforms, so who can do it? So journalists, they don't have resources. We talked about that at the previous session. If you want to start a nonprofit, or, good luck finding how you're going to fund this. It's quite a challenge. Plus, when you do fact-checking, we also have to keep in mind we're, Canadians on all kinds of social media platforms. So you have to kind of fact check all kinds of channels where people are, which kind of challenge it. So down to solutions, I'm going to close it, and hopefully we'll have very fruitful discussions around these possible solutions. Automation is important, so automatically detect deepfakes is critical because of the volumes. It's not a trivial solution. The state-of-the-art tools fail, a lot of the times. And even if they fail 10% of the time, it's enough to put this, seed distrust in their recommendations. Some promising user studies showing if we train humans, us, a little bit, the detection improves, and the sum of the percentages indicates that the accuracy depends on the modality. So text, a bit harder for us to detect, quite actually almost 50-50, not very good. But some other modalities may be a little bit easier to detect. But these numbers coming from last year, I bet you if we do the same experiment with the current state of the art in Gen AI, it will be much harder for humans to differentiate what's authentic, what's not. Then, so that moves us to the third kind of bucket of solutions put here: certification, fingerprinting, watermarking, and some kind of decentralized registry of Gen AI content. So we've seen industry was moving some promising, proposing some promising initiatives like requiring users that contribute Gen AI content to their platform self-declared, but then they quickly kind of track back that implementation because, well, yeah, we all take vacation pictures and we Photoshop them or use other AI technology to enhance them. So does that, should I also self-declare that is created with Gen AI tools? So that's one side of it. The other side where you have companies, like Google, OpenAI, Microsoft, the companies that actually develop technology to generate those Gen AIs, they can put watermarking and fingerprints in those digital objects that everybody will generate. So either can be hidden, like fingerprinting or watermarking, where there's visible small label on the object. But of course, it's not foolproof. It can be removed afterwards. And with open models, like there's lots of buzz about DeepSeek, those of you who've been following, but there are many other models that anybody can actually use, or train your own models where there is no oversight or requirement for those developers, for those models to embed any fingerprinting or watermarking. So that's also not like a single proof solution, but in conjunction, maybe that's the kind of coalition we should be thinking about. And finally, I'm going to close here. I think I'm over my time already. Apologize. But as organizations that may be working in this space, we have to think about not just digital literacy. I see it as like more targeted activity, but also public service announcements to do kind of pre-bunking when we following the trends, and we can expect that there will be a wave of certain disinformation, Gen AI generated especially. We can inform the public to keep an eye on that and tell them what are the reliable sources where they should be going to. And that's a lot of it that was happening during COVID-19 pandemic. So those are good case studies to learn from. And readiness assessment is more kind of for internally. So for your organization, look around, what are your activities are more likely to be targeted by Gen AI type of attacks, cyber threats, spam flash type of campaigns. So be ready, build an assessment. I dropped this screenshot from X, and this is a unicorn screenshot. I'll tell you why it's a unicorn. I don't see that. This is like first time I see it. Why? You have this Gen AI picture of supposedly church building that survived the California fire recently, but it's generative AI, so it's not from there. And we see two labels attached. X put a label stay informed, manipulated media, and then there's a reader's edit context. This is coming from community notes. Well, this is a unicorn because X usually don't put any more manipulated media, and most of the images from LA, fake images, don't have that label. And on the other hand, community notes also failed because 80% on average of community notes are not visible to X users because they didn't reach enough consensus. All right, I just dumped a lot of it, a lot of content on you. And again, this is deepfakestracker.org. Get in touch, and looking forward to that conversation today.
Well, thank you so much for that, Anatoliy. I hope that most people from the first panel are still here watching, because I think you actually responded to a few questions from earlier. So we're already putting a little bit of meat on some of those questions that we have left unanswered. So thank you so much for that. And with that, I will invite Michael, our next panelist, to present.
Hi there. Thanks for having me. Let me just try sharing my screen here. That all working out?
Yes, it looks great.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. Michael Khoo with Climate Action Against Disinformation and Friends of the Earth. We started our project 2018 with the basic premise that the vast majority of people want action on climate change, but there's a very small group of people who have been blocking that action. And we've grown that coalition from just 5 or 6 groups in the United States to now 50 groups globally. And through the last, say, especially the last 3 or 4 years, we had some very strong movements that we were able to participate with and advocate for getting climate change disinformation policies out of all the top 5 companies. So we got policies out of Facebook, 2 policies out of Twitter back in the day, demonetization policy out of Google, helped Pinterest with their policy, and TikTok. Those were, in hindsight, it being the beginning of 2025, those were the easy days. These are some of the groups that are part of our coalition. I wanted to, in this session, with Andrew's guidance, come up with 6 major themes of what we've sort of discovered or learned through the last 7 years of this fight, of the 6 different solutions or areas of solutions would suggest. So I'm going to go through each one of them here and probably take just about 5-7 minutes. So the first obvious thing is to remove the incentives. There's so many incentives for climate change disinformation. First being the fossil fuel companies themselves, massive amounts of subsidies we give them, the very lax rules we put on greenwashing. Many of you are in Ottawa and may have been around for the Global Plastics Treaty that was negotiated in Ottawa last year. You may have seen the massive advertising campaigns that the plastics industry took out. These are all things that, basic borderline fraud that the industry has been doing for decades, really. That's on the producer side. You have the producers of disinformation, and then you have the distributors of disinformation. And that would be the big tech companies, the corporate monopolies that Google has made, Facebook has made, that have absolutely no transparency. And the thing that we've really focused on in our coalition over the last 2 years is the monetization of disinformation. Disinformation isn't just some organic thing, or it's not even just something that Elon Musk puts his thumb on the scale, though he does do that. Disinformation is a huge industry. It could be up to $50 billion. And the World Federation of Advertisers says that the ad tech market is the second largest source of income for organized crime globally, right after drugs. And this is because the ad market, through the monopolization, principally from Google and Meta, has created this giant black box where so much money passes through. And this didn't exist 15 years ago in the industry. And so it's this, if you don't remove the amount of money people are making from disinformation, both the grifters and the primary producers of it, we're never going to get at the core elements. And we have things like the Digital Services Act here that I highlight that are possible way paths for us to open up that transparency. But for right now, there's a giant, well-funded mechanisms going against us. The second category is to create a cost. When you see in the top left here, this picture from the 1980s of when Big Tobacco was called to Congress for hearings, or Bernie Ebbers on the top right. People caught for crimes go to jail. Whereas on the bottom left there, you see Rex Tillerson, former Exxon CEO, and all of their CEOs, and Mark Zuckerberg. These companies have not been held to any account in the same way that we would expect out of a baby seat manufacturer, people who make food processors, to have the basic standards of safety, transparency, and accountability. We can create these systems somehow. When it's in the online realm, we think that we can't do these same things that we expect out of everything else in our society. And so now, especially in the last 2 weeks, as I'm sure you've all seen in the United States, we have a government and a tech industry that is acting with total impunity because they know they can get caught, as Mark Zuckerberg did just 2 years ago, falsifying evidence about the harm of social media to teens and lying about it to Congress and not paying a single price. We need to create a cost for the individuals who are responsible. Third, don't create new and harder problems. Apologies, I have to show pictures of these two people. The first thing is the backpedaling from the tech companies, the evisceration of the trust and safety departments over the last year to 2 years from Meta and all the other big companies. AI adding to that with the additional slop. And with these two people in particular, the counter lawsuits. So 2 members, at least, of our coalition are being sued by Musk currently. And as Trump weaponizes the US government, we all expect to be targeted through that. And it is interesting to note that not only was that one of his first executive orders to talk about disinformation, or what he calls a free speech issue, which we actually think is a free speech issue too. We just believe in fairness. It was a topic the first week. It came up in the very first press briefing, and they are targeting researchers, disinformation researchers, because they know how existential this fight and this conversation is to their agenda. So we need to not allow our currently very hard problems to get even worse by cutting off the process of research, for example. Fourth, I'd say, we need to spend as little time as possible on the after the fact solutions or the techno fixes. In the climate change realm, we've had longer conversations about carbon sequestration being very expensive and not very effective, or green hydrogen, or space panels, or recolonizing Mars with all of humanity. all sorts of fanciful things. There are those similar things in the communications realm too. And AI fact-checking versus human fact-checking is one part of it. Or even saying like schools need to teach media literacy, or we need community policing of Meta, which they've now switched their fact-checking networks to. All of these things are shifting the blame from the producer to the user. Here over on the right is a picture of my mother. First time I put my mother in the presentation. And, I had a conversation with her recently where she was feeling very confused about the difference between her email and her Gmail. And she's 70 years old, but she's a bright woman. And the fact that 15, 20 years into using the internet, it is harder for her now than it was before, is what Cory Doctorow, one of your countrymen, says is the enshittification of the internet. And it is important to understand the intent of how we got there, and that it is a long con, which has really the only goal of how to monetize my mother or how to monetize my 13-year-old child. There's a reason why everything has become harder, why search has been created to be so terrible, is because they are not thinking about making the internet better. They're actually trying to confuse people. So I use the analogy of, because in my early days in Toronto, my first campaign was working on to actually stop the blue box system from replacing the deposit return system that we had before it, is that everyone says, do your part, recycle. And that's everyone's first primary sense of duty to the environment. But really, this has been a giant PR campaign by the petrochemical industry and by Coke and Pepsi to offload their corporate production and their waste stream onto individuals and make them feel guilty. And, in 1992, getting an award from the United Nations for all their great work to create recycling systems. This idea that we need to, as individuals, or even I need to force my school to ban cell phones, that is putting onto individuals what is a corporate problem that can be switched, that can be fixed. And anytime someone says you can't have, it's asking too much of these companies or it's too expensive, you look at how much money they have, you look at the switches that they can flip or choose not to, and you think, it's hard to believe that they say they can't fix this when they're talking about colonizing Mars. So there are obviously alternatives, the shift from what Twitter was promised to be to maybe blue sky. But really it is about corporate requirements and not commitments. We've gone through the giant roller coaster of being excited about getting Facebook to take one action or TikTok another. The only real solution is to be focusing on primary regulatory behavior like we expect, again, out of every other industry. And in my last slide, I'll just say, which I echoed from before, the actual long-term solution, especially in what now is really the darkest of days for America, is to hold hands. And it sounds pithy or it sounds trite, but it is being intersectional and it is building community and meaning it. Because the fight for the rights of trans youth or the rights of women for reproductive health is the same as the fight for climate change, disinformation, and climate policy. There is a small group of people who are targeting all of us, all the centrists and all the progressives. And we need to realize that. And even if we are being beaten down for many years, hold hands very closely. And the last thing I'll say is that, just that Brian Merchant has this great book last year called Blood in the Machine about the rise of the Luddites, which is a pejorative term now, but is a fascinating thing for anyone to look further into, of the movement in the 1810s in Britain when they automated the garment industry and had them populated by orphans stolen from London and violated all sorts of laws. The Luddites were really not anti-tech. They were anti the abuse of the power that technology was giving. And the protests that they inspired took fire all across the country, to the extent that the British government pulled back tens of thousands of troops from the Napoleonic Wars to come and crush physically and kill the Luddite protesters and to criminalize the actual ideology of being a Luddite. So it's important to think that the last time this happened, 200 years ago, the response was incredibly violent. It was authoritarian, but that everything that they wanted had the widespread support of the British people at the time, just as our movements have that widespread support. So thanks for the time. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
And thank you so much for that, Michael. I mean, I like that note that you left it on with holding hands. I mean, I think this has been a few points now that have brought this issue back to an issue of humanity and the need for us to work together. Probably not through these crazy techno solutions, whether it's geoengineering or colonizing Mars, but instead with people-to-people solutions and thinking about those around us, speaking their languages and meeting them where they are. So thanks again for that. And Sonja, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I will just take a moment here to share my screen. Let me know if that's looking okay.
Yep.
Perfect. So thanks again for having me. I'm Sonja Solomun. I'm an assistant research professor at the Max Bell Policy School at McGill and the deputy director of the Center for Media, Technology, and Democracy. And we've been looking at information health and online harms for over 5 years now. And so I'm going to share some findings from our recent report that looked at climate disinformation and delay narratives in Canada specifically. And I can go ahead and link that in the chat here as well. So I'm very happy to follow Michael because the monitoring and the analysis that CAT has done has been really instrumental for us here at McGill, and their monitoring of climate delay narratives around COP26 specifically was kind of a direct point of departure for this report. So I think despite the fact that social media platforms enable the Canadian fossil fuel industry to amplify climate change disinformation, I think the salience of these narratives and their connection to kind of our broader petro identity remains fairly understudied. So we wanted to examine this intersection and look at how climate disinformation is both shaped by and integrates within our kind of daily beliefs and cultural frames and myths about, longstanding myths about inequality that we have in this country, especially because Canadian understanding of climate change is so intertwined with, considerations of identity politics, including regionalism and Indigenous politics as well. So, we came at this from the lens of climate obstruction as a kind of a broader conceptual umbrella and a methodology. I think it doesn't need much rehearsing, but it broadly refers to campaigns and other actions that are led by very well organized, very well financed networks, as we've heard today, of corporate and other actors who have actively sought to prevent action and policy for the past 4 decades at the very least. And I think that, these campaigns often we've seen shape public debates. They affect political support and collective mobilization to mitigate climate change. So I think for those of us working in this space, this framing is rather implicit, but I do think it needs to be made explicit beyond just kind of an academic exercise, because it allows us to sort of zoom out beyond just a tech focus and look at the broader media and information ecosystem, which really gives us both a concept and a roadmap beyond just the platform level to look at how information is consumed, distributed, and shaped. And then beyond that, really crucially, it allows us to look at the broader power relations, including the economic and political interests and the ways that technology, people, and systems intersect. So this has been the case for a number of years now, but I think it's been really rendered explicit kind of recently, as we've heard today with Meta and Instagram ending their fact-checking programs. So this has very real implications, right? The targeting of environmental activists, the obstruction of policy around the world. And I think climate disinformation and denialism is really a site where we've kind of historically seen the fusion of tech and political power. And I think that has just become more explicit recently, but it's perhaps not entirely new. And so our report, it echoed kind of the established influence of key actors in this space, including the fossil fuel industry, the lobbyists who have funded climate denial and lobbied against climate change, the political actors, as well as the alt-right media influencers. But we also really wanted to highlight in our work platform companies as kind of a distinct actor in this network because they are actively obstructionist in their policies and their decisions. And that has significant implications for democracy. So this is a broader map of the structure of obstruction done by the Climate and Social Sciences Network at Brown University. And so even here, tech actors aren't really explicitly named, and they have a very particular way of exerting their influence that shapes many of these nodes and edges here. So in terms of the actual narratives that we tested, so we surveyed approximately 2,000 Canadians, and we took our focus, as I mentioned, from 4 established global climate delay narratives that were derived from the monitoring done by CAD in partnership with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. And because of the historical context of our respondents and the longstanding history of colonialism and anti-Indigenous racism here in Canada, we also hypothesized a 5th climate delay narrative around Indigenous involvement to explore if and how the co-option of narratives about Indigenous values and participation in the fossil fuel industry informs the broader debate around climate change. And as we know, disinformation finds, resonance because it attaches itself, partially at least, because it attaches itself to dominant and historical myths about inequality. So we really wanted to get at that lens as well. What we found are that hypocrisy and elitism, so the claim that those pushing for climate action are elitist and hypocritical, and therefore their recommendations are illegitimate, emerged as the most persuasive, suggesting some resonance with, discontent and distrust in government action, as well as politicians' sincerity. A little more than half of our respondents resonated with the absolutionism narrative, the idea that a given country or region or province, often this narrative is targeted toward Alberta, should be, or the rest of Canada should be absolved of climate action because other countries or regions like Alberta bear more responsibility for addressing their kind of outsized impact. And we also saw a similar, just close to half of respondents agreed with kind of the ethical oil framing as well, which was a narrative that justifies Canadian extractivism by promoting the idea of our oil as more ethical than oil produced in countries with poor environmental and human rights frameworks. And more than a third actually believed in the Indigenous kind of empowerment narrative, suggesting ideas about suggesting that Indigenous participation is kind of successfully co-opted and leveraged to foster this wider support for oil and gas projects through these disinformation narratives. So we also found 2 kind of prominent gaps in public perception, one around impact. Most Canadians believed in climate change, around 77%, but less than half believed that they were currently impacted. And then another prominent gap around the economic trade-offs. It resonated significantly that climate action is too, quote, costly or disruptive to economic security. In terms of actionable solutions, these are just a few. I'll echo Michael. The really key one for me is that we need robust accountability through things like risk assessments, transparency mechanisms, such as the EU's Digital Services Act, particularly requiring platforms to disclose algorithmic impacts. The UK's recent kind of greenwashing crackdown, which targeted misleading corporate claims. The second is kind of a broader platform governance frame. I think there's also a way that climate is cross-cutting within an emergent platform governance agenda set out by Heidi Tworek and others working in this space that has explored policy solutions to challenges around content, data, and AI, as well as the economic incentives and infrastructure of platforms more broadly. And the future of online harms legislation is ambiguous in Canada once again, but these issues these issues are ones that any administration should take seriously. I'll also highlight the need for data access and collaboration. Just this is really urgent. Platforms I'm not very hopeful about the data access part, and so I'll highlight the collaboration. I think we do need to collaborate amongst research and civil societies, organizations working on this issue. And finally, I think we really need to highlight the local impacts. So we need more work and research on the local impacts here in Canada, which can kind of help bridge this identified impact gap. And I'm very encouraged by work at the local level. So I'm keen to hear Heidi present on their work on the municipal level. So I will leave it there for now. And if anyone wants to get in touch, I am always happy to chat about these and other related issues. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much for that, Sonja, and that localization of impacts and then how that might drive solutions, I think is important to think about. It's something that's come back quite often. And as someone who's, again, been studying climate change for well over a decade, even in my mind, it's always been something a little bit far. And I keep thinking about 2 summers ago when I woke up in the middle of the night and thought my house was on fire because I could smell smoke and realized it was actually the wildfires. And being here in Ottawa, we've never really been that close to them, but seeing as climate change is more and more coming right to people's doorsteps all around the world, it'll be interesting to see if that can have people work more closely with their communities and realize that climate change is not this distant, far off issue that we are going to have to at some point deal with, or that people in the global south or maybe out west are dealing with. So yeah, I really like those thoughts in working towards solutions as well. And as you spoke to some of Heidi's research, I will welcome Heidi to take us next.
Thank you. I've decided, following Michael, to be the Luddite of the panel and not have a PowerPoint. It's just a great pleasure to be here. I'm newer to the climate space, but have been working for a long time in the mis and disinformation space. So I'm going to talk today about a project at CSDI, which I'm doing in collaboration with Chris Tenno, Divya Badani, Nicolas Coté, Maddie Sides, and Ghassan Hamzeh. And we'll have a report coming out in March about the question of climate mis and disinformation on the municipal level in Canada. So as most of you know, cities produce more than 70% of greenhouse gases. But what we identified was a bit of a gap in really trying to look at how municipalities in Canada were dealing with problems around climate mis and disinformation. So we did around 17 interviews with different people at the municipal level, did some focus groups, and we also did some social media analysis as well, trying to do some deep dives into some of the examples that we've seen around misinformation at municipal level. So you can think about the 15-minute cities at Edmonton, heat pumps, and then we also did a bit of an international scan to look at some other examples, well known, I imagine, to everyone here, like the ULEZ debate in London, for example. So we identified a few specific problems on the municipal level in particular. The main one that I'd highlight is simply the problem of capacity. Municipalities are incredibly stretched. They're trying to take actions around climate change, but they find themselves already at capacity, and then suddenly they're confronted with a deluge potentially of mis or disinformation, and in some particular instances that doesn't remain within that local environment but rather moves to the national or even the international level in the case of the 15-minute cities disinformation campaigns around Edmonton. So what we've tried to do then is to come up with a few buckets of solutions that municipalities and municipal policymakers can think about to try to ensure that if and when this does happen, they're not taken by surprise. So we suggest that there are really sort of 4 timeframes that municipal policymakers can think about. There's the long term of trust building, there's the short term prevention in advance of the pre-bunking that Anatoliy mentioned, there's the short term of rapid response to when you have a disinformation campaign, which we saw, for example, in the ULEZ situation, and then there's the long term of really reacting to ways in which residents within municipalities may be very divided after a mis or disinformation campaign. So we're first setting out this idea that there's a broader time frame on which different kinds of solutions need to happen. And then we've got 4 buckets, I think, of solutions for policymakers to think about. The first one is thinking about different levels and modes of very concrete collaboration to build trust over the longer term. We suggest there's 2 levels. One is horizontal and one is more vertical. So horizontal means having collaboration between different groups of people, potentially in different municipalities working on the same issue. So one example of that is the Zero Waste Council in Metro Vancouver, where you then have people working on waste issues collaborating in the various cities within the Metro Vancouver area, so that if something should emerge, you have a group of people, a network already who can respond. Collaboration on the more vertical level, then going up, obviously, from the municipal all the way up to the international. We see that happening more within the European Union, where there have been some disinformation campaigns, for example, in cities like Dortmund, where they can then reach all the way up to the European level. And there are certainly things like ICLE within Canada that can help to facilitate that sort of vertical collaboration. The second bucket of solutions that we are thinking about measurement. That actually really being able to measure the extent and the impact of misinformation, firstly, gives you a baseline, but also helps municipalities who, as I've said, have stretched capacities really figure out where to put them. So I'll just give a couple of examples of what measuring the impact of misinformation could look like. It could look like trying to understand what policies and programs are being implemented and impacted. So what initiatives and plans are delayed, what goals are reduced, what are the costs of that? What resources and labor hours are being wasted. So what staff time is being diverted to counter climate misinformation? How much does that cost? The third, what's the mental health impact? Burnout, stress, and anxiety among staff, who has to take health leaves and so on. The fourth, trying to think about the impacts on democratic resilience, for example, trying to understand effects on public trust. And then fifth, can we try and understand the impacts on communities as well? The sixth way that we could try and think about impacts is also to start doing what, for example, the city of Victoria is doing, which is to try to quantify the cost of doing nothing. So too often it's claimed that climate action is expensive, but then there's nothing to counter that, right? And so what the city of Victoria is doing is developing a cost of doing nothing framework, which is trying to quantify the financial and social risks of doing nothing. So if somebody comes at the city of Victoria and says, it's so expensive to do X, City of Victoria says, well, look how expensive it is to do nothing. It's actually much more expensive to do nothing. The District of Saanich, similarly, conducting cost-benefit analysis to assess climate-related infrastructure viabilities. So that sort of thing, trying to measure those impacts in advance, gives you something that's actually able to come out with a positive frame of, look, we're actually saving money, and that helps to, in a way, pre-bunk as well. The final 2 buckets of solutions. Third one is community engagement. This goes along, Andrew, with what you were saying about whole of society solutions, thinking about how to have long-term community engagement. The examples that I know best come from the health space. We saw, for example, with the Mpox pandemic within British Columbia, how important it was that the BC CDC had very long-standing relationships with queer groups built up through years and years of discussions around HIV and AIDS. And that meant that when Mpox was happening, there could be immediate consultations about what's the kind of language we need to use, how do we reach out to groups. There was trust already there, that kind of community engagement. Couldn't have foreseen that there would be Mpox, but when it did happen, those years of trust really came into play, and we need to think about similar kinds of ways of doing that in the climate space. And then fourthly, and finally, but not unimportant, is thinking about safety for those who work in municipal offices. So how to ensure that those people have support in case of any kind of online harassment. We can think about institutional policies that we've learned now through bitter experience through the COVID pandemic, and how we want to think about implementing them for those working on climate action policies at the local level. So we still have people who want to work in those spaces, who want to be talking about them because they also know that their institutions and their employers will have their backs and will protect them in case of harassment. So I'll end there, hoping that we have lots of time for discussion, and thank you so much for such a great panel.
Yes, thank you, Heidi, and thank you to the rest of the panelists as well for a lot of really interesting interventions. I mean, I think I could monopolize at least the next hour, probably all evening, posing you questions that I've been thinking of myself, but we will turn it over to the audience shortly. I would welcome everybody in the audience to use the raise hand function, the virtual raise hand function in Zoom. Once you do so, we will actually bring you into the Zoom room so that you can, if you so choose, turn on your webcam and open your microphone and actually pose your question, which goes back to the human centric need for dealing with these kinds of things, and by building those kinds of relationships of trust, as Heidi was just speaking to. So we certainly want to see and hear from you to the extent possible, though you may also just use the chat box, and I've seen a couple coming in already through the chat box, so if you would like to submit your question via text, that is fine as well. Either way, we ask you to keep your questions fairly brief. And if you would like, please introduce yourself, your name, and maybe where you're from, a bit of what you do. But you may also, I see some of the questions are coming in anonymously as well, and that is completely fine. So you can either pose questions orally, in person, on camera, via the chat box, or as discussed, we do have the MIRO board function as well. For those of you who were not here with us before, we'll just do a quick refresher right now. Nico is going to give you a quick rundown of how this sort of what I call a digital brainstorming tool works. You can see how the earlier panel brought together a lot of different thoughts on these post-its in the columns that Nico and Richard did great to organize. And Nico is just going to give you a quick rundown of how this works, and whether you are posing your questions verbally in the chat, verbally or in the chat. Either way, we welcome you to contribute your thoughts, whether they are responding to questions, posing more questions, or any thoughts you'd like to share with us or the panelists. If you do keep them here, we are going to keep this as a working document after, and we're going to share these MIRO boards with the participants and panelists as well, so everybody can have something to take away from this session as well. So Nico, if you want to just give everyone a quick rundown of how this works again, though I can see a lot of people are already making good use of it.
Thanks, Andrew. So as mentioned for the first session, the MIRO board is meant to sort of serve as a shared space for our brainstorming and collaboration today. And it's meant to help us track in a structured way all the insights, challenges, and ideas that have come up in the discussions. To help keep things a bit organized, we've set up this second session with the following categories. So immediate priorities and actions. So what are maybe pressing steps we can take right now to address climate misinformation? Second is barriers to implementation of these steps or actions, followed by innovative solutions and emerging ideas. Finally, we have how to build long-term resilience, so looking at systemic reforms or long-term efforts. Following up this, there's an other category for anything that doesn't fit neatly into those categories. If you'd like to contribute, adding a sticky note is pretty quick and easy. Once you're in the MIRO board, you'll see that there are two work areas. Zoom in on the one that's on the right this time. And after having a look at what's there, figure out the category that best fits whatever input it is that you would like to share. You can click on the sticky note icon that's on the left-hand toolbar. It's, again, the square icon that has this folded corner on the bottom right of the square. Next step is to pick a color. The color does not have to be an exact match. And then you can just click anywhere inside that category or column where your input fits best. At this point, you just need to type in your idea, your comment, your question. It's best to try and keep it short and clear if possible. And then you can drag and drop to adjust the placement further if needed. This is all of our opportunity to bring in our expertise, our experiences, and our ideas. Everything that's added here will help shape the themes and priorities for the upcoming Climate Misinformation Summit in June. Again, the rule of thumb is no need to overthink it too much. Whether it's a quick thought, a challenge you see, or a useful resource that you're familiar with, all contributions are very valuable. With that, I'll hand it back to Andrew to kick off the Q&A.
Thanks so much for that, Nico, and thank you everyone who are sharing their thoughts on the MIRO board. As I mentioned, please start raising your Zoom hands virtually, and we will bring you into the room to pose your questions. We do already have a few in the chat box, so feel free to put them in there as well. I've sort of picked 3 out of the chat box already that I'm going to start with, and then I'll ask a couple of the panelists to jump in order. But I will pose a few questions at a time so you can kind of pick and choose what to respond to. These ones all overlap a bit, and they're kind of questions I share as well. So the first is, what leverage do we have with private companies running the platforms underlying the information ecosystem, which is, I think, a great question. What do we do about Meta stopping to fact check, as several of you spoke to? This speaks, I think, mostly to what Michael was saying, but we might have thoughts from others as well. So industry is a convenient scapegoat. Blaming them is convenient, as it provides individuals with the justifications for our inactions. We use gasoline, individuals and groups, pension funds, etc., invest our money in industry and expect high returns. Individuals buy goods and services that have a large climate footprint. Now, I think this is kind of the counter argument to Michael's, and I see both sides of it, but happy to have Michael or others' thoughts on there. And then just a third before we launch into these. Do you have any examples of framing relationship building and long-term collaboration as an outcome, i.e. to garner investment and allocate resources? Often in our capitalist/colonial system, capacity is assigned to quantitative outputs, toolkits, etc. Maybe I'll turn it first to Michael, because one of those seemed most specifically to him, and then I'll bring in the other panelists after.
Great, and this is the core question, and I think our answer to that has changed a lot over the last 5 years. When at the beginning, getting public shaming seemed to work quite well to get the attention of companies. Indeed, at a certain point, they were falling over themselves to see who would launch a better climate disinformation policy. We certainly have lost that leverage. I would say there's two things. Leverage point 3 that we have right now. One, obviously, the Regulation Digital Services Act is one. Canada can do similar things. 2, the brass tacks of the advertising industry. And this is the money that is being spent by big brands that accidentally ends up next to swastikas, and nobody likes that. And every time we point it out, companies get upset, or in the case of Elon Musk, they directly sue the people who pointed that out, Center for Countering Digital Hate, who's currently fighting that off. But I'd say actually the most nonpartisan answer really is just transparency. This is only happening because we have created a series of black boxes where someone puts their thumb on the scale and nobody else can tell where that thumb is landing, how big that thumb is, etc. So even for the point that this sort of secondary point of, is this our fault because we want to use social media? I would say that transparency would make that a fair conversation. It's not fair until we have that transparency, because it's not that we just want to use a toxic platform to hurt each other. In fact, for someone, I'm age 53, so I grew up on earlier versions of the internet that did not have any of that. Facebook, when it first started, before it even had the news feed, was actually your friends were in your feed. What a surprise. And to think about that now, where all you see is advertisements and slop, but it started with the promise of connecting you to your friends. You literally can't see your friends now. So that's something where we don't have, we're still, on ramp to all these different platforms. And to get off, sure, but that is like asking an individual to solve what was a structural problem by someone with a ton of money to deliberately gaslight you. TED Talk over.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that points to a lot of the difficult questions that we have to wrestle with, right? When these kinds of problems are built into our capitalistic system. And as we talked a bit about on the last panel, how as the climate is falling apart, so are a lot of our systems of governance. That makes addressing a lot of these things very difficult. Sonja, did you want to jump in on any of those questions?
Yeah, I think the question of personal responsibility is an interesting one. I think it's certainly true. Individuals obviously consume fossil fuels and products with a carbon footprint. But I think the issue here is framing, right? So framing this as a purely individual issue of personal responsibility, I think overlooks kind of the scale, right? Anatoliy spoke about the scale of industry influence and kind of the structural barriers that we have to meaningful change. And the reality is that industries, particularly and specifically the fossil fuel companies and big tech, have kind of actively shaped the choices that are available to individuals through things like disinformation and lobbying for decades. So I think systemic problems require systemic solutions. Individual actions certainly matter, but I do think they will always be sort of constrained by the larger structures in place. I'll echo Michael. We need stronger regulation, corporate accountability, and a real shift in our economic incentives. And without these, I think the risk is just placing undue responsibility on individuals, while just allowing the biggest polluters to sort of continue business as usual.
Thank you for that. I think we'll go to Heidi next to hear some of her thoughts on this, though I do want to push us a bit. So I think it makes a lot of sense that we have these systemic issues and we need systemic solutions with better, more effective regulation and such. I guess my question is, like, how do we then realize that? All of us in this room are in agreement on that and know what that could and should look like. But most Americans just voted for Donald Trump, and most Canadians are probably about ready to vote for a government and prime minister who is not going to be very interested in stronger, more effective regulations. So understanding that ecosystem in which we're living, I mean, how do we realize those kinds of systemic changes? And as I mentioned, we'll go to Heidi now, but we can certainly come back to this a little bit more.
Yeah, a couple of things. So in terms of the questions about framing relationship building, the example that I gave from the BC CDC is, I think, a really good one. And not everything has to be quantified, but it can be useful to have some things quantified, just because then we have something that we can measure against a baseline. So that was some of our suggestions of measuring impact. But in terms of trust building, one of the reasons that sometimes doesn't happen is because it can seem like a fuzzy goal where the outcome is uncertain. But actually, I think those concrete examples of knowing that when there is a crisis, those trusted relationships are what are going to get you through, not necessarily the things you do in the heat of the moment. So I think that using those examples is actually a very good way of how one can frame that as an outcome. So you can think about it in, in the LinkedIn nomenclature of networking, or you can think about it, I think, more fruitfully as trust building and having people whose jobs are to do that. And that can mean all sorts of downstream things, like thinking about people who speak the languages that are necessary to work with those communities, thinking about the role of religious leaders. There's all sorts of ways in which that can unfold. I think, again, here we could learn a lot from the mistakes of COVID, where much of the distrust also stemmed from having very particular spokespeople and having people speaking to rather than speaking with communities. So there's a whole host of what we can learn from that and hopefully implement in the climate space.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Heidi. Anatoliy, did you want to jump in on this sort of initial set of questions we've been discussing?
Yeah, this the first question about the influence, how we can influence social media platforms. It's very similar to other industries, right? You either legislate, which we as a small power, Canada has don't have much influence on social media platforms. We surely tried, but so we cannot count on that. Or you have community, users who have to make decisions. So same debate we were having about other industries. Blue Sky, you mentioned, Andrew, I think earlier, one of the panelists, a decentralized platform emerged as alternative to X, and we see a movement of users from X making conscious decision, growing that platform to now, I believe, 30 million, and developing those content moderation tools to keep that information environment safe and healthy. But those are hard choices for people to make. It would help, of course, if we see some of the organizations and institutes speaking out to say, hey, we're not going to support particular platform. We're not going to contribute content, and we're not going to advertise on that platform. So perhaps those influencers and organizational users of platforms that maybe don't treat us well as users, maybe you should step up.
Great. Thank you very much for that. So I think now we'll go in reverse order. So if it's okay with you, Anatoly, we'll come right back to you. I've got quite a number of questions. So I'll start with another batch of 3 here that sort of speak to each other. The first is a bit more general, and then the next 2 are a little bit more specific. But coming back to the whole of society approach, how can we develop tools and approaches for countering that are effective for all, either international, corporate, government, national, municipal, etc.? And if different approaches are needed, how can that be orchestrated? How can these different approaches be orchestrated together? One of the more specific questions, the question says, how does our language need to change between generations? And I would build on that because we often speak about needing to meet people where they are. And I often talk about speaking people's language. And that for me doesn't mean speaking French or English or Arabic, but instead means speaking the kinds of language that people engage with in their daily livelihood, the kinds of things that mean something to people, whether that is about how to cultivate the land nearby or go to work in their office building or the kind of vehicle they're going to need to drive. So how many types of languages do we need to know, and how can we also use that to interact with these various complex things that we're discussing, which also speaks to the third question I'll add in there. How do we communicate complexity without overwhelming the public? And I think we know that all of these things are extremely complex. And if we want to simple and boil these things down to kind of left, right on the political spectrum, I think the right has been very successful at delivering more simple, solution-oriented solutions, whereas the left maybe often gets bogged down in these kinds of solutions because they are extremely complex problems and then do demand complex solutions, but we can lose the public in trying to communicate that way. So Anatoly, if you can jump in on any of those or speak to them very broadly, it would be much appreciated.
Yeah, well, good group of questions. I don't think we're going to have a simple solution covering all of those stakeholders, but I can take the question about a language, perhaps not necessarily in terms of narratives, but in terms of the way we communicate online, and looking at younger generations and the use of visual social media communication tools and platforms, like TikTok. It's a conceptually different way to communicate. So they easily remix things. They don't just remix words, they remix sounds, musics. So I think getting engaged with that community, understand at their level how they communicate, what the values are first, rather than waiting for somebody else to do that. I think that will be critical.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that speaks to some of the problems with polarization in our society as political parties very specifically try to target smaller and smaller groups of voters rather than speaking to broader, diverse communities. Thank you very much for that. Heidi, did you want to share your thoughts on that group of questions as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's so important about one of the main things I took away from Sonja's presentation is the number of Canadians who think that climate change hasn't already affected them personally. I find truly shocking. And so that, I think, is a place to start. If we think about the heat wave in British Columbia of a few years ago, where over 600 people died, which was more people than had died in BC from COVID up to that point. Every single person in BC was affected in some way by 40 degrees Celsius heat. And so I think finding ways to communicate about those impacts seems to me really crucial. And there's a whole host of different ways of doing it. And that goes back, at least in things that we're looking at, to this capacity problem. How do you, as a municipality who might have one person thinking about communicating around all municipal affairs, how do you then, even in this one issue of climate, communicate on TikTok and LinkedIn and press and radio and TV? So I think thinking about how we deal with the capacity question, because it's really easy for me to sit in my office and make a whole bunch of recommendations of what could be done, but how do we create the capacity for that to actually happen? So how do we get the young people who are doing the remixing, Anatoly, that can then be picked up by municipal policymakers? That seems to me one crucial piece of this puzzle.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I really like the way we are putting these pieces of the puzzle together and really starting to come to more of these solutions that can be practical and implementable. So thank you for that. Sonja, did you want to share your thoughts on this sort of bucket of questions?
Yeah, and maybe if you don't mind, I'll use it to kind of segue into the next question around citizens' assemblies. which was directed. It's a fantastic question. How can democratic innovation, i.e. deliberative processes like citizens' assemblies, be part of diffusing polarization and building social cohesion? So I think, in terms of capacity building, relationship building, diffusing polarization, citizens' assemblies are a really effective way. We've hosted and collaborated on a number through the center, and we are always very surprised that at the end of the 3 days, Canadians from all walks of life, all different provinces, will come together and sort of unanimously agree on a set of recommendations for something as contentious as online harms. And so, citizen assemblies around the world have been pretty generative around the issue of climate change specifically. And so, there's something to be said for these very kind of fact-based structured discussions that takes us away from the influence of mis and disinformation, partisan media. They do sort of tend to organically move towards shared kind of pragmatic solutions rather than these ideological extremes. We've also seen this in France's Convention Citoyenne pour le Climat, which really directly led to stronger climate policies. Really effective ones in Ireland as well. So I think that this is a key sort of site for enhancing social and democratic legitimacy and kind of disrupting both the real but also manufactured polarization, if I can say, created by lobbying and corporate interests. So I will reach out with information about further citizens' assemblies that we're hosting, if interested.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Michael, did you want to share your thoughts on this set of questions?
Yeah, and thanks, Sonja. That makes me very nostalgic to want to move back to Canada. It's very, very hopeful to hear, and it really does, like, as multiple people have said, like, to hold hands in whatever form we have to. And I want to key off the last thing you said there of like the manufactured polarization, because, the United States, we have like Kamala lost by 1%. And she talked about being the daughter of a single mother. But the other side spent $160 million in the state of just Ohio on transgender reassignment surgery ads. So that is not like American society has lots of problems, but that actually isn't one of them. That's one that we just sort of feel they have. So I think that's just like important to like level set and focus our solutions on real human things. And lastly, like in November after we lost, I was trying to think of like, what is something that does unify people in this simplistic language that we always think it's easy for them to be simple. We're always complex, wonky people. But I think the concept of fairness is probably the most universal thing that I could think about. You see animals in the wild and one animal steals food from another and they all react, that they see that as unfair. And that is exactly where we are at now in a vastly unfair society in a number of ways. And it's certainly got a real point been put on it when you see Trump with 3 billionaires behind him. That fairness, I think, and maybe the bullying and the lawlessness that is allowed due to that, those are 3 words that I think will work for us unfortunately, for the next 4 years. So to just keep that in our hearts, that the things that we want of fairness is like, it is universal, and people in every walk of life all believe in that.
Yeah, thank you very much to all the panelists for your thoughts on that set of questions. We've got kind of one big overarching question that I will pose now, and then we also have one specific to Heidi. So I'll leave it up to everyone and give a moment for you to respond to this question, and maybe we'll start with Heidi because one is specifically directed to her as well. And welcome any thoughts on this question, as well as any kind of broader closing thoughts that you have, as we have just about 10 minutes left for the panel today. So the question is, what might be some strategies toward coalition building in public interest group and municipal leaders and politicians? And I would build on that and reframe it a bit, because we've talked a lot about the importance of coalition building, but a lot about the problems and difficulties with doing so as well. I think it sounds great in theory and practice, and I think I advocate them, for them. and I think that I have advocated for them specifically in the paper and some of my framing comments for this question, but I think specifically Anatoliy pointed to the real problems with this. At our launch event on October 1st, Catherine Hayhoe spoke a lot about the very promising potential of meeting people where they are and speaking to people who would paint themselves as kind of a very red Republican in Texas. And it seems that there can be some successes had there, but I wonder how much success. How can we really continue to build these coalitions? And do we need them to be sort of smaller coalitions of the willing and work with the people who might already be somewhat like-minded to us? Is that enough? Or if we do need to reach beyond sort of our smaller groups, how do we do so? And we've begun thinking about this a bit, but if we can flesh that out a little bit more to think about how we can practically do that and then lead that towards solutions. So that's sort of the big question for the group to close us out. But the very specific question that was left for Heidi as well, and I'll let Heidi start by responding, is that you mentioned the use of pre-bunking, and the person is curious about the effectiveness of that method. Was there any longevity concerns, effectiveness over a couple of weeks? And a couple other panelists spoke about that as well. So if we can speak a bit more to the effectiveness of pre-bunking. And I think with that, is this the kind of thing that we need to have a small army or a large army of people on every social media site pre-bunking all the time or on all the news doing this? Do we have to pre-bunk every kind of thing? Is this the type of war that will have to be perpetually waged to keep pre-bunking all of the disinformation claims that are going to keep coming and keep proliferating when we have fires, when we have, God forbid, the next pandemic, when we have, other extreme weather events? So if Heidi, if you want to start speaking to those two questions, and then we'll move back through the panel once again.
Yeah, so I guess one way of thinking about pre-bunking is I don't necessarily think about it as pre-bunking a specific set of facts, but rather specific types of narratives. And Anatoliy can obviously talk more about this as well. So there are different modes of pre-bunking. So people have tried, for example, gamifying, where what you are pre-bunking is the methods of disinformation. And there are multiple experiments that look at this. If you encourage people to think about the accuracy of what they're reposting, that has some effects on how much information people repost. I will say that the problem with much of this research is that it's experimental psychology research, which means it's looking at particular moments in time and not necessarily at the longevity. We have less evidence of that. And of course, it's looking at a particular instance of people's behavior within a world of information. So it's not looking at information as an ecosystem, which is more of the approach that I think we need to continue to take. So I don't say we should use pre-bunking as some kind of panacea. It is one element of what we can try to use as we continue to research its efficacy. And there's a whole host of researchers looking into the different ways in which this can potentially happen and trying to think about longer term effects. Final thing to say about it is when we look at things like fact checking, the general consensus is that, yes, people will change their minds on facts, but they won't necessarily change their belief system. And so then it depends what we're really trying to do here. Does it matter whether you believe one particular fact, or does it matter what your entire belief system is and how that belief system is tied to your identity? Okay, in terms of the bigger questions you're asking, I guess I want to put on my historian hat and say something completely different, which is that, in the 19th century and the early 20th century, caring for the environment was a right-wing concern. The Nazis were big environmentalists, right? Like, it's an uncomfortable fact, but it's true. Teddy Roosevelt is the one who's creating the national parks. All the way up into the 1970s, evangelical Christians are the ones who are environmentalists. And so we exist in a very different world today, but that is not so long ago. So the idea that caring for the environment is somehow tied to a left, centrist, or political identity is a recent historical invention. To me, that's really important because it shows that all of this is malleable, that actually every human being, regardless of their political identity, of course has the capacity to care for the world in which we live. They have different reasons for doing so. It can be religious, can be political, can be personal. But that speaks to actually trying to not think about this through a political lens, because that political lens changes to think about, for all human beings who do have a deep capacity to care for the environment and the world around us and our future, how do we speak maybe in those terms? And that could perhaps get us a little bit further. And I think it gives us hope that we don't have to remain in the information environment we're in now. It can change actually surprisingly rapidly.
And I very like those words of hope, because it can be a little bit difficult researching some of these topics, but I do think there are lots of reasons for hope. Thank you for that, Heidi. Michael, did you want to share some thoughts on either the specific question in relation to pre-bunking or the larger question on coalition building?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on pre-bunking, so definitely Heidi had great comments there. I would say on coalition building, because we've been doing that for 5 years or so, I've got actually an article we put together about what a weird process it was to build the climate disinformation coalition. And it really was based on what I think is the broad theme I'd like to leave with, like some amount of freedom and listening. And, if there's any, I would never use the term woke mind virus, but if there's anything that they do have right on their side, is that the right wing, if you look at its media ecosystem, it is forgiving. It allows all sorts of terrible people, all sorts of people making mistakes, and it is rich and it is diverse in a way that ours is not in our online ecosystems. They've built that up by having some amount of belief in freedom and listening that our side has slowly, through our media ecosystems that we've built, not had. We have mastered email on the one-way technologies. So that's, I think, holding that everybody wants that freedom, and we all want that freedom. We want freedom from Trump or Musk controlling our information ecosystems. And that really starts with listening and not being the lectury side of what our side can be. Yeah, and so if anyone wants to see like what it took to build that coalition, it really was CAD is a coalition of the willing where nobody tells anyone else what to do. That's my single description of it. And people are only there because many people had to lie to their bosses that they were doing this because it was so off topic, and to allow for that organic and uneven edges to people's job descriptions and personalities. I think that's what allows actually truly more richly knit together ecosystems.
Thank you for that. And it's important to remember those things that we all share, right? I mean, so often I think that mentioning freedom in a weird way almost has a negative connotation these days, because of the way it's been kind of weaponized. And it reminds me of, for the first time in my life, I felt a little bit embarrassed to have had a Canada flag on my winter jacket when I was skating on the canal back when the truck occupiers came here, because they were all waving Canadian flags. And it can bring a real different connotation to these things, but it also reminds you that at the end of the day, we all do want freedom. And I think we all do care deeply about our country and about being Canadians. So thinking about how these kinds of things that so often drive us apart don't necessarily have to, I think is important as well. Anatoliy, did you want to share some of your closing thoughts on a couple of these questions?
Yeah, I think we talk a lot about fact checking and pre-bunking, and I think it's nothing wrong with reminding people every time a disaster coming, hurricane coming, we remind people what they need to have at home. Why don't remind them what to make sure to keep an eye on online during those times? But other than pre-bunking, debunking, what we found in our own experiments, putting labels on things does help, does reduce the propagation of harmful disinformation. Particularly, people will be questioning why should they repost or engage. Not everybody. So what we call it is soft moderation. So like people, like Michael's comments about what values of freedom, and the word of content moderation in our space became very polarizing. It's like a censorship almost. So soft moderation is something else. It's giving you tools for you to decide whether the content is potentially misleading, and little things help. Like nowadays, when you encounter an image on a website, you can right click and say search for that image if anybody else used that image elsewhere. So little things can empower a lot of people. That's all I want to say.
Great, thank you so much for that. And that concept that you left us with, empowerment, is I think something that's come back many times today, and something that we've got to think about a lot, right? Not trying to direct who should be thinking what or doing what, but thinking about how we can empower one another for our shared values and thinking about these concerns. Sonja, did you want to offer some concluding thoughts on these questions, and anything else that you'd like the people to take away from today?
Sure, no pressure. I really like the question around coalitions. Obviously, Michael is far better placed to answer than I am, but I really think the key here is really how the coalition is structured, and harping back to citizens' assemblies, which is such a distinctly Canadian and hopeful concept. I agree. It's being intentional about the design of the participation process within that coalition, and bridging across sectors and ideologies. I think if we're like-minded and small, it can sort of move quickly and build a lot of momentum, but can also become quite insular and reinforce existing silos. So I do think that the real challenge and opportunity is kind of bridging across geographies and ideologies and sectors. I really like the concept of holding hands on our way to do that, and building trust, because that's what's going to get us to a different place.
Yes, thank you so much for that. Hopefully everybody can join me in thanking the panelists for a second great panel today. I've very much enjoyed this and learned a lot. And hopefully everybody, I know that we're getting very close to everyone's weekend. We plan to take just about another 20 minutes or so. For the next few minutes, Nico is just going to take us through some of the key findings from the MIRO board today, just to give us a really quick overview of some of the key findings. I will then take a few minutes after that for some wrap up on the two panels and some of the key takeaways before Jennifer closes us out for the workshop. Nico, did you want to take a minute now to just give a quick overview of the MIRO board?
Yes. Hi, everyone. So over the course of today's discussions, we've captured obviously a wealth of elements, a lot of insights, challenges, and ideas. So on this MIRO board. So first, we'd like to thank everyone who contributed. Your input has been essential in surfacing these themes, and these will help shape the work ahead. So in the first session, in column 1, about vulnerabilities, participants identified quite a few areas where climate misinformation takes hold. There's talk about the role of social media algorithms in amplifying misinformation and the reinforcement of echo chambers. There's talk of the polarized political climate, which makes constructive discussions about climate solutions more difficult to talk about and explore. In the second column, around resilience and trust, despite these vulnerabilities and challenges from column one, a lot of you guys highlighted clear sources of resilience, like local news outlets, the power of narrative-based storytelling, the importance of digital literacy, and so on. In the third column, several ideas are there and resources were shared around collaboration, like strengthening media science partnerships, expanding cross-border collaborations between journalists to track misinformation narratives across different regions and languages. And then that being said, there's still quite a few unanswered questions and knowledge gaps that you guys identified. So how to reduce psychological distance without amplifying fear and dread? What are the most effective ways to debunk misinformation at scale? And so on. Turning now to maybe the second session, there's quite a bit here as well. You guys shared a lot of concrete steps that should happen now. So focusing on priorities like strengthen platform policies to limit the reach of repeat misinformation spreaders. A lot of talk of coalition building with municipal leaders and public interest groups to drive local action and so on. In the second column, that has to do with barriers to implementation, there was pretty broad recognition of the real world challenges that hinder progress. So these are structural barriers like policy gaps, lack of funding, political resistance, and so on. And then practical challenges like technology limitations and so on. In the third column, innovative solutions and emerging ideas, there were quite a few forward-thinking suggestions like AI-driven detection of false narratives to track and counter misinformation in real time, crowdsourced real-time fact-checking on major social media platforms, and so on. And finally, in terms of building long-term resilience, there were a lot of contributions that pushed beyond just the short-term fixes, obviously, pointing again to systemic and sustainable change. So that being said, in terms of next steps and continuing the conversation, we'll share the MIRO board with all participants so that you can revisit and build upon today's insights. All of us here, the InfoLab team, will be synthesizing these contributions to identify themes, emerging priorities, and actionable takeaways. And I just want to reiterate that the collaboration doesn't stop here. These ideas will directly inform upcoming working groups and help to shape the agenda of the summit that we are organizing for June 2025. So thank you to everyone for your engagement today. Your expertise, perspectives, and contributions will play a crucial role in strengthening our collective response to this issue, this challenge. So with that, I'll hand it over to Andrew again for his reflections. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Nico, and thank you for those of you who have remained with us. We will keep this really brief. Again, I don't want to stand in the way of your weekend. We talked about a lot of important and interesting stuff today. I mean, I have a few thoughts to share about this. One of the things I've been thinking about is a book that I read by Ray Dalio called The Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order, Why Nations Succeed and Fail. And I think Dalio does a pretty effective job of really looking at a long-term historical perspective of these large-scale cycles that the international order takes, and largely it follows the rise and fall of hegemonic orders and a lot of what comes with it. I think he does a fairly effective job of demonstrating these patterns throughout history and showing what leads up to these changes in order, a lot of the realities that are present at this time, and the ways that world order can change. He doesn't go so far as to explicitly state that at this moment we are in one of these periods of a changing world order, but he does start to point to a lot of things that we are sharing, a lot of realities we are sharing in the world with what led up to a lot of the changing world orders. I think that we are seeing this in a lot of ways. I mean, one of my favorite articles is by Susan Strange. I think it was written in 1987, and it is entitled The Persistent Myth of Lost U.S. Hegemony. People have been talking about the decline of U.S. hegemony for 50 years, and it has not yet declined. But I think we're seeing more and more challenges to U.S. hegemony, and more broadly, challenges to the liberal international order, the way we make rules, the way we govern ourselves, and that speaks to a lot of the things that came up today. We heard a lot of people talking about how there is a parallel in the deterioration between our climate, which I think is extremely evident and all around us, and our deterioration in our systems and mechanisms and institution for governance, which would be the kinds of things I think we would normally rely on for effectively dealing with problems like climate change and with disinformation. But we're seeing this confluence of crises and issues where, as the climate crisis gets exacerbated, we are being paralleled by this rise in disinformation, which is undermining our ability to effectively deal with the climate crisis, but also effectively undermined our ability to deal with the recent COVID-19 pandemic and so many other issues that are going on in society. And again, part of this is because of a breakdown of our institutions. And that is, I think, in part because our institutions have failed to maintain trust in a wide enough segment of the population. Now, certainly, one thing we heard a lot of today and that we cannot overstate is social media and the tech giants that are out there are, at least in part, a significant part of this issue. They are profit-driven, similarly to fossil fuel companies, which have been driving a lot of these disinformation campaigns for, as we heard, decades and maybe even centuries in some cases. And as a result of the internet and social media platforms, they've really been able to supercharge and weaponize these disinformation flows, which are working in a period when we are not adequately equipped to deal with these kinds of things. So we have all of these competing problems overlapping one another. these are the scary things, these are the problems, but what we heard a lot about today is reasons for optimism also, and ways for dealing with this kind of stuff. And one of the things I was thinking about as I was trying to think about kind of how to summarize these approaches is actually anthropocentrism. I think we often think about anthropocentrism as a bit of a negative because we think about humans first, humans above all else, and for a large part, that is why we've come to this problem to begin with. I mean, I think having humans first and above all else in human development has led to the sixth mass extinction that we're experiencing right now, a lot of the problems associated with climate change, and a lot of the other ills that are going on in the world as well. But by thinking about humans first and bringing humans back into the equation and bringing us closer together and thinking about holding hands and thinking about our neighbors and coming back into contact with humans, I think that's almost the first step for envisioning this type of whole of society approach. Social media is a problem. We've talked about the algorithmic problems, the fact that there are more and more people out there who are able to profit off distrust and disloyalty and sowing division and posting headlines that lead because they bleed. All of these issues associated with social media are problematic. But one of the most obvious problems with social media is that we are getting a lot of our social interaction through it. And as a result, we are not going outside. We are increasingly societies of people who sit in the backyard instead of the front yard. And we are more and more distant from our neighbors, from those in our community, because increasingly our communities are over the internet, are through social media. So if we think about anthropocentrism and think about being human-centric in our interactions and thinking about being human-centric in our approaches to solutions, we can start moving past some of the problems of social media, of technology, of the internet, and perhaps even of polarization that is driving us so far apart. Because part of polarization is finding people we agree with over the internet, rather than those we might agree with that don't live too far from us, or might even live or act in a similar livelihood. I saw an interview of someone recently that spoke to me, partly because I play hockey, and he was giving an interview and he mentioned one of his favorite things to do is play sports. And I thought, well, me too, I love playing sports. But then he continued because he said most of his day is spent working in politics and within political and public debate, which has so often become so toxic that often it's not very fun. He doesn't engage or he doesn't enjoy engaging with a lot of his friends, family members, or neighbors in political debate because it can be so toxic and polarizing. But he said when he goes and plays hockey, it's just a bunch of people in the dressing room and on the ice talking about hockey or what they're going to drink after or what they've done with their families that week. And he said he doesn't know the political leanings of anyone in the dressing room because they don't necessarily talk about politics. And I think when we in these mediums so often think about society, public debate, and social media, we see the worst of this societal debate happening in front of us, which is so often extremely polarized and toxic. But it's also because it is not really anthropocentric at all, because while humans are engaging with their keyboard, they're not actually seeing or engaging with the person on the other side. And the more that we can have more of those human connections, I think the more we can work towards those whole of society approaches where we can bring private industry to work with journalists and intellectuals, scientists, more effectively communicate science, meet people where they are, as we hear so often, and as was mentioned by so many in their comments today, and to be able to speak a common language, a language of humanity, meeting people where they are, and thinking about all of our livelihoods, because our own livelihoods, our families, and those around us tend to be what we put first. And if we can understand that our neighbors are thinking about the same kinds of things and that we all do want the same things, I think this can really help contribute to our whole of society approaches. I don't think there's any silver bullet or panacea, and this might sound a little bit high-minded, but I think I am certainly guilty of something of it, and it's been something that I've been a bit conscious of today, thinking about this anthropocentrism and thinking about the humanity that kept getting brought up during today's discussion, because I know when I sit either in my office at home or in the ivory towers of the institutions of universities, doing research. So often it is very solitary, and so often, even though I'm embroiled a bit in it every day, the issues of climate change do seem distant. And while I am probably more than most aware of the particular difficulties that marginalized populations feel with these kinds of things, they still aren't the kinds of things that I interact with every day or that I get to feel in any visceral way, which I think creates problems for researchers, even those of us who are extremely conscious and concerned about those kinds of things in general. So I will leave my remarks there today. I just really want to once again thank you everybody so much for all of your thoughts throughout the day, and thank you for spending a very long afternoon with us. We hope that this is not necessarily the start, but maybe a midway point of ongoing conversations. As mentioned, I do hope that those of you who have not had a chance to will look through our report to think about the questions and engage with us by sending us any thoughts that you do have on any of the guiding questions that are in that report. And again, I will reiterate, think about and share with us any questions that we may have missed, things that we haven't thought about today. We welcome these kinds of conversations, and we hope that this, again, is only a midpoint, and we hope we can continue these discussions along the road to the summit and at the Climate Summit in June. And with that, I will thank you once again and turn it over to our director, Jennifer Irish, for some final closing notes for the day.
And it is a Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock. I'm amazed how quickly this session went. It's been 4 hours, but it's been lively, it's been engaged. And first of all, Andrew, thank you both for your fantastic and thoughtful summary today's proceedings. And also, it's been recognizing it's been no easy feat. We had over 100 organizations here today participating in our event, drawn across Canada. We had academic institutes, government organizations, including environment and climate change organizations. We had some embassy reps, private sector and technology firms, and community and advocacy groups. It's been a great cross-section. We've had a lively discussion and some great takeaways. I also just wanted to take stock of some of the wave top takeaways that we'll be following through as we prepare for our next events. I think it was extremely informative that we looked at climate change and mis and disinformation on different levels. We started with the international, how bewildering it is that the IPCC and in international conversations around climate change, mis and disinformation has not figured prominently. And we know that's going to change. The UN, UNESCO are very committed to make sure that going forward, we will have a space for looking at mis and disinformation. And there are coalitions, including those organized under Climate Action Against Disinformation, that exist, and we certainly want to be part of that to make sure that that's injected at the international level. And then we talked about the importance of the municipal level, Heidi Tworek bringing forward the capacity issues of dealing municipal level. We talked a lot about corporate, technology, and advertising sectors, how it's important to remove incentives, create costs, and focus on the structures around them, sustain those misinformation narratives rather than people who are receiving them. On the approach, we talked a lot about the need for a multidisciplinary approach, whole of society, and some of the challenges that we face in coming up with those types of responses that can resonate across these different levels. Finally, we talked about combating mis and disinformation in practical ways. How do you go beyond fact checking to make sure that we have compelling narratives that sustain interest, that have the same passion as some of the hate narratives that are built into mis and disinformation. The importance of taking the high ground, not getting into fear narratives, but empowering people and making them see a broader vision that can come out when we actually do take action, and we take action that's informed by evidence and by science. That theme of the challenges of communicating science started off with our launch in October with Catherine Hayhoe, and it is a theme that we will sustain right through to our summit in June. I would like to take this opportunity to thank those who organized this conference, especially from my team, Nicolas, Rutherford, and Richard Pinet, also Sonja Obradovich on the event side, and Danielle Nicolas, especially Andrew for your commitment in making sure that not only we had a well-moderated event today, but the paper that you had developed in advance of this session was extremely useful and will remain an important blueprint as we go forward. I do just want to echo sentiments that Andrew had already underscored. This is not an end. This is a beginning. Please continue the dialogue with us. There are more issues in that paper and some of our other products that remain kind of fertile ground for more conversation. Certainly, I thank so much our panelists for bringing in new injection of thoughts, research, perspectives, viewpoints. We are very proud and pleased to be part of a broader coalition, which includes all of you. In the next couple of weeks, we'll be releasing a new paper on visual and multimodal disinformation that did not figure prominently this session. It'll figure extremely prominently at our next one in Montreal at the CRIM facilities, where we're focusing on technology solutions and practical toolkits. And just to mention some of the other benchmarks that are coming your way in Montreal, we'll also be hosting a specialized conference on the Arctic, and climate change and disinformation, how it plays out there, how it fits in with the geostrategic developments in the Arctic. And finally, do be part of our summit, the 17th to the 19th of June here at the University of Ottawa. We're hosting a new innovative center. It'll be in part a continuation of coming up with practical and policy solutions to climate change and mis and disinformation. We'll have a solutions fair there as well, a research poster competition, and even a game competition, which hopefully will all come to a head at that event. So I'll leave it there. Thanks again for all of you for spending your Friday afternoon with us today, and for the incredibly useful perspectives that you brought forward in our discussion.